What if Earth once had no land at all? Just ocean, sky, and silence. There was a time, not in human memory, nor even in the distant dreams of fossils, when Earth did not yet know the shape of continents. When the skin of the world was unbroken, smooth, and silent. Not by peace, but by youth. No crust had fractured, no mountain had grown. Only the ocean, endless and absolute, gently wrapped the planet like a lullaby repeating in slow circles. No birds crossed the air, no eyes yet opened beneath the waves. Just water above heat, vapor breathing over liquid, a world without form, and still it spun. It spun not because anyone was watching, but because gravity has its rhythm. Heat from the core pushed out while space pressed in, and somewhere in that push and pull the earliest winds began. Not the winds we know, not the winds that move trees or sail ships, but chemical winds, breathless flows of gas exchanging whispers between sky and sea. The air itself was different then, thicker with carbon, woven with methane and ammonia and faint streaks of hydrogen lost to space. No oxygen yet, no blue sky. The sun shone dimmer, veiled by clouds too ancient to name. Maybe they weren't clouds at all. Maybe they were just moods in the sky. And beneath that veiled sky, the ocean covered everything. No islands, no beaches, no coral, no place to stand. A global ocean, dark and warm, absorbing sunlight and returning it as a murmur. The waves moved with no memory, no coasts to break upon, only circling and circling, guided by the whisper of a moon still settling into orbit. The tides were different then, higher, stronger. The moon was closer. The planet spun faster. A day might have lasted only 6 hours. Time, like land, had not yet taken shape. And yet, in that formless world, something was happening. Beneath the waves, heat welled up from within. The planet's heart, its molten core, had begun to beat, not as a sound, but as a slow churning beneath the ocean floor. Because even when there was no floor to speak of, convection was already at work. The beginning of drift, of tension, of coming fractures. Beneath the water, the mantle stirred like a slow-breathing dream, and tiny pockets of crust, still soft and half-formed, began to feel pressure. Not because they were meant to rise, but because they couldn't stay still forever. Maybe that's how it always begins, not with intention but with imbalance. Energy searching for escape, heat trying to move toward cold. In that endless sea, subtle ridges started to grow. Invisible at first, just swelling cracks where magma brushed water and cooled into something slightly harder than before. The birth of protocrust. Nothing solid yet, nothing permanent, but difference, texture, something to build on. And still, the oceans wrapped around it all. Heavy, comforting, vast. They held the warmth in like a mother holds a newborn. The first continents, if they can be called that, may have floated, not as land, but as lighter rock barely able to rise above the mantle's warmth. Pieces of protocrust, thin, scattered, catching the breath of the inner earth. Suspended, hovering beneath the waves, waiting. What would it have felt like to drift above such a world? No land to orient us. No familiar north or south. No mountains to catch shadows. No rivers to trace a path. Only clouds above and the dark, moving mirror of ocean below. Would it have seemed lonely or peaceful? Would the silence have felt empty or full? We often think of beginnings as loud, as violent, but maybe Earth's earliest chapters were written in slowness, in warmth, in softness, before continents scraped across each other. Before tectonics gave rise to storms and craters, there was stillness. A planet murmuring in heat, wrapped in its own breath. Not because it had to be quiet, but because it didn't yet know how to make noise. And in that quiet, the ingredients of everything were being stirred. Minerals dissolving in seawater. Volcanic gases changing the sky's composition. Lightning carving through clouds, striking the surface, triggering reactions that would one day build life. But not yet. For now it was only patience. Earth was waiting, not idle, but preparing. And deep within the mantle pressure kept building. The protocrust thickened. Some of it sank. Some of it was reborn. But a few patches, just a few, managed to stay afloat. Slightly less dense. Slightly more durable. Tiny shields of buoyant rock, caught in a delicate balance between gravity and expansion. These floating fragments may have been the ancestors of continents. The earliest hints of land. Still buried, still submerged, but beginning to separate from the endless sameness of the sea. Could it be that Earth dreamed of land before it was land? That the memory of shape was already embedded in the way minerals fused and melted, in the push and pull of molten cycles deep below? Is it possible that identity forms before form itself? The ocean may have covered everything, but beneath it, difference was awakening. Change doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it begins with a slow inhale, a pause in the rhythm, a warmth that becomes too much to hold. And yet, if the ocean once held the whole world, what might it still remember? Perhaps it remembers the heat, the slow, endless churn of something rising from below. Not suddenly, not with force, but with inevitability. For even in silence, pressure gathers. And even in darkness, something stirs. Beneath the ocean's vast stillness, the mantle was not still. It moved like breath, slow, circular, ancient. The Earth's interior exhaled warmth through unseen cracks, and in that warmth came fire. Not the fire we know, not the kind that consumes or roars, but the molten fire of beginnings. Liquid stone, thick with minerals, glowing with entropy. This was the fire that didn't destroy, it built. It whispered to the seafloor in a language made of temperature and tension. And in answer, the crust began to split. There were no earthquakes yet. No mountains breaking skyward, but there were ridges, long, winding lines where the planet opened its seams. Mid-ocean ridges, not named, not mapped, but real, cut paths through the seabed like birthmarks. And through them magma rose, not because it chose to, but because it had nowhere else to go. The Earth was young, and young things cannot hold their heat, so it spilled. Magma surged upward in slow threads, meeting the cold dark of the ocean above. And when heat met chill, it hardened, forming pillows of rock, strange and bulbous, stacking into new seafloor. A quiet architecture of fire turned to stone. This was not yet land, but it was the start of pattern, repetition, growth, the making of texture beneath the waves. We tend to think of fire as a destroyer, but in Earth's earliest age it was a midwife. A gentle force bringing new shapes into the world. And those shapes, the newborn crusts, began to drift apart, pulled by the very currents that birthed them. Oceanic plates, young and fragile, slid away from the ridges, slow as thought. Subtle motion, one edge rising, another sinking, an ancient lullaby in tectonic rhythm. The mantle convected, the ridges pulsed, and with each pulse, more magma, more crust, more rearrangement. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. But it was relentless. And it was from this slow reshaping that the first scaffolds of continents would one day emerge. Not because the planet wanted land, but because fire cannot stay hidden forever. What if the continents were never built from above, but coaxed into being from below? Could it be that what we now call land began not with solidity, but with flow? A whisper of heat. A nudge of buoyancy. What if stone first learned to rise because it remembered being weightless? Deep beneath the ancient sea, fragments of lighter rock began to accumulate. Not all magma was equal. Some cooled into denser basalt, sinking back into the earth. But some formed granites, lighter, more buoyant. These silicate-rich stones resisted subduction. They lingered near the surface, layering slowly over eons. They didn't rise high, not yet, but they stayed. And in staying, they became the seeds of land. Maybe land began as an act of refusal, a resistance to sinking. A choice not made by will but by chemistry. Silica, oxygen, aluminum, forming alliances in molten form, cooling into persistence. These cradles of proto-continental rock gathered beneath the ocean, hidden but growing. They did not breach the surface, but they waited, patiently, as if knowing their time would come. And around them life stirred. The first microbes clung to the warm cracks of these hydrothermal vents, feeding not on sunlight, but on minerals and heat. Life too was born in fire, in the embrace of a planet too young to be gentle. But gentle somehow it was, because the fire did not devour, created space, shelter, possibility. Could it be that everything we now know as stable land, biology, identity was forged in a time when nothing was certain? Is it possible that life, land, and even memory share the same origin, not in structure, but in flow? The ocean still covers much of the planet, but beneath it, the mid-ocean ridges still breathe. The Earth is not done. The magma still rises. The plates still move. Land is still being made, not in an instant, but in whispers. And beneath our feet, the fire continues to shape the future, just as it once sculpted the past. Maybe the Earth has always known how to cradle life, not because it was designed to, but because it couldn't help but do so. Maybe warmth, pressure, and time are enough to write the beginning of a story, even without a page. And if fire could once build a world beneath the sea, what else might be hiding below? There is a silence beneath us, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of depth, of slow, unending time. Beneath the shifting plates and the growing crust lies the mantle, a place we can never touch, but that touches us constantly. It moves, not quickly, not loudly, but with the rhythm of a planet exhaling, a rhythm too slow for breath, too long for memory. And yet it remembers. This deep mantle, this thick, semi-solid sea of rock, flows in convective loops. Heat rises, cool sinks, the cycle continues. Over millions of years, continents drift because of it. Oceans widen, mountains form, but beneath it all, the mantle moves, carrying with it the faded patterns of Earth's first heartbeat. Somewhere inside these massive currents are traces, not of bones or fossils, but of arrangement, of ancient temperature gradients that never fully smoothed out, of chemical anomalies locked into the rock when the world was still assembling itself. We don't see them directly, but they're there. Faint isotope trails, subtle mineral signatures, geological whispers. Could it be that the Earth has a kind of memory? Not a conscious one, but a memory etched into motion, into warmth, into the behavior of its own layers. What if these slow circles of stone are like neural loops, repeating, cycling, adjusting, not because they know how, but because they always have? The patterns of mantle convection are not random. They are shaped by what came before. Just as the path of a river remembers the mountains that once guided it, the flow of the mantle recalls the scars of early impact, the remnants of protocontinents, the afterglow of magma oceans, the collapse of ancient lithospheric roots. Things we will never see, but that the mantle has never forgotten. Maybe that's what makes this layer so mysterious. It does not record history in fossils or sediments. It does not keep time in tree rings or ice cores. It moves, and in that motion it stores something softer than evidence, something like rhythm, like mood, like habit. The plumes that rise from the deep mantle may be echoes, ancient upwellings from a time before the crust was solid. Some of them are still hot, still rising, still feeding volcanic islands like Hawaii or Iceland. Others have quieted, cooled, sunk back down, but they leave a trace, in the chemistry of basalt, in the speed of seismic waves, in the subtle bulges of Earth's surface, not because they want to be remembered, but because forgetting takes more energy than the Earth has. We think of stone as static, unmoving, cold, but the mantle is warm, viscous, alive in a way, a living memory not of creatures or civilizations, but of the planet itself becoming real. And just as the brain doesn't remember every moment, but repeats certain loops again and again, the Earth too seems to return to patterns. Supercontinents form, then break, the plates rearrange, then reunite. Every few 100 million years, there is a pulse, a rhythm. Gondwana, Pangaea, Rodinia, different names, same beat. Could it be that the convection cells beneath us guide these reunions? Could the mantle be gently folding the world back into itself, over and over, like hands reshaping dough? Maybe, maybe not. But something is guiding the dance. And the source lies not above, but below. Geophysicists speak of slabs, pieces of crust that have sunk into the mantle through subduction. Some of these slabs are ancient. They fall like memories into the mantle, dense and cold, sinking through the hotter rock like lost artifacts. And just like old memories, they distort the flow. They bend the pattern. They make the present behave strangely because the past is still there. The deeper they sink, the harder they are to see. But they do not disappear. They stay layer upon layer, slowly changing the texture of the deep earth. Not as ruins, but as influence. Invisible scaffolds around which new motion is built. What if memory doesn't need to be conscious to matter? What if the Earth's identity is shaped not by what it forgets, but by what it repeats without knowing why? There are places beneath Africa and the Pacific, deep anomalies, dense and hot, that may be remnants of the earliest Earth. Not crust, but something older, something from before the surface solidified. These zones resist the convection around them. They sit still while everything else moves. Geologists call them thermochemical piles. But maybe they're more than that. Maybe they are the buried heart of a younger Earth, still pulsing, still waiting. Could they be the origin of the plumes? The source of volcanic life? Or are they tombs? Dense with heat, too heavy to rise, too proud to vanish? We may never know, but their presence shapes the world above them. They are quiet shapers, memory made dense, gravity made personal. And if the Earth remembers its own shape in such slow, molten ways, what else might it remember? What else lies beneath us? Moving, unseen, forming the background of everything. And yet, if this much can be carried in heat and rock, what might be waiting in the crust above? At first, there was nothing but sea, an unbroken hush of mineral blue, swaying softly over a world without edges. No shore, no forest, no mountain to hold time in place. Only depth and warmth and a silence too deep for memory. But in the quiet darkness beneath that global ocean, something shifted. Slowly, in fits and starts, as if the planet were learning to rise. Fragments of lighter rock, forged deep in the molten underlayers, began to drift upward. Not like bubbles, not like leaves, but like thoughts, tentative, wandering. Slabs of protocrust less dense than the sea of basalt they emerged from. Ancient survivors of a chaotic birth. They didn't breach the water in triumph. They didn't carry life. They simply floated, blank, bare, suspended between the fire below and the ocean above. These were the first rafts of stone. Not continents, not yet. Just small islands of stability in a world still pulsing with heat and chemical fury. Zircons buried in their cores tell us they existed. Tiny crystals, older than memory, older than bones, older than the sky as we know it. They record a world still covered in steam, wrapped in volcanic haze, where even a single grain of solid rock was a miracle of balance. Could it be that continents began not as power but as pause, not as dominion but as drift? The early rafts of crust didn't last. Many were swallowed again, recycled into the mantle by the same heat that raised them, subducted before they could age, forgotten before they could change anything. But some remained, not because they were stronger, but because they were lucky, because, for a while, the forces around them let them exist. Maybe it was never about permanence. Maybe the Earth had to try many times before anything could stay. The chemistry of these early survivors was strange. High in silica, low in iron. They resisted sinking. They warped the flows around them. And with each passing million years they grew. Not quickly, not cleanly, but piece by piece, accreting fragments, stitching together wandering blocks like broken puzzle pieces from a dream that hadn't yet decided what image it wanted to be. These proto-continents didn't have names. No trees crowned their surface. No river cut across them. No eye had ever seen their jagged edges rise through the fog. But still they mattered, because they marked a shift. A shift from a world in motion to a world with memory. From constant churn to something that could begin to hold shape. And isn't that what all identity begins with? Not definition, but contrast. Stillness in a place that was never still before. The oldest rocks we've ever found, those ancient tonalites and granodiorites, the worn roots of what once floated free, speak to this moment. This tentative upward reach. They tell us that even at Earth's youngest, most chaotic time, something was already trying to last. Could it be that these first rafts were the ancestors of continents not yet imagined? That their drift seeded the patterns of crustal growth still playing out today? Maybe, maybe not. But they are part of the story, a quiet, patient beginning, and what they floated through was not an empty ocean. The water above them carried dissolved iron, carbon, maybe even the building blocks of life. Hydrothermal vents breathed into the sea from the ridges below. Lightning cracked across skies thick with methane. Somewhere, amidst this chemistry, the impossible began to assemble itself. And these rafts, silent, mineral, lifeless, were watching. Not with eyes, but with presence, with surface, with the ability to be touched, to collect, to remember without knowing they remembered. One day, a billion years later, those stones would carry forests, cities, footsteps, but not yet. For now, they were simply floating. And even floating, they had weight, influence, gravity. They bent the flow of water around them. They cast shadows on the seafloor. They warmed under sunlight I had yet evolved to see. In their stillness, they became landmarks in a world that had never known what it meant to have a landmark. And as more rafts rose, others collided, melted, merged, subducted again, reborn as magma, layered into newer crust. The cycle repeated. Entropy tried to smooth them down, but they resisted, not because they were strong, but because they were different. And sometimes that's enough. Even today, the heart of modern continents holds fragments of these first attempts. Ancient cratons, Archean shields, hidden roots of a time when land was not a place, but an experiment. And if those stones could speak, what would they say? Would they remember the feeling of floating alone for millions of years? Would they remember the moment heat turned to shape? Or would they remember nothing at all, and still change everything? And yet, if even these drifting stones once rose from fire, what else might have begun, unnoticed, beneath the waves? Long before maps, before names, before anything could be found or lost, there were oceans. Not oceans as we know them, with borders and basins, coral coasts and continental shadows, but oceans that had no edge, no shore to meet, no land to kiss, just water, circling itself in silence. A world wrapped in blue, resting beneath a young sun that had not yet steadied its breath. These seas were not still. They moved endlessly, pulled by wind not yet tamed, stirred by currents born from the uneven cooling of a planet finding its skin. But they had no destination, no harbor, no landfall. And so their motion was pure, not because it was peaceful, but because it was unbroken. What is a wave if it has no beach? What happens to rhythm when it's never interrupted? The water circled and circled, whispering only to itself. Every molecule pulled forward, only to fall behind again. Every crest a beginning that never quite arrived. Maybe this is what eternity feels like, not stasis, but repetition so vast it becomes invisible. Oceans without shores, sound without echo, time without marks, and still, they carved. Not cliffs, not coastlines, but heat. They pulled energy from the planet's skin. They mixed nutrients rising from deep hydrothermal vents. They sculpted temperature gradients. They built weather from nothing. Slowly, perhaps, they even invited chemistry to get curious. To bond, to unbond, to try again. Could it be that this endless water, shoreless and unseen, was the first laboratory? Not because it held life, but because it didn't yet know it couldn't. Within these global seas, subtle differences began to emerge. Not everywhere at once, but here a patch warmer, there a trace of sulfur, somewhere else iron, dissolved, waiting, The building blocks of biology, carbon, nitrogen, phosphate, began to swirl in new arrangements. Not meaningful, not yet, but promising, suspiciously complex. Patterns that seemed to almost want to persist. And always, beneath it, the crust simmered. Ridges cracked and stitched, breathing heat into the depths. Volcanic chimneys painted the seabed with minerals. Black smokers hissed into water that had never tasted light. The ocean absorbed it all, not with intention, but with patience. Imagine a world where every direction is water. No trees, no clouds, no sound but wind against water and water against itself. A womb of salt and shadow, a lullaby that never needed a voice. Maybe that's how time began to matter, not because anything changed quickly, but because something finally stayed the same long enough to notice. Maybe that's how memory was born, not in brains, but in patterns of temperature and salinity carried by tide. Entropy still reigned. Of course it did. Heat dispersed. Molecules decayed. But even entropy has texture. Even chaos has gradients. And within those gradients, pockets of order began to linger longer than expected. Not because they were meant to, but because once in a while order happens. Could the ocean remember even then? Could its movement fold space into memory, chemistry into meaning? We don't know. We can't know. But somewhere between the tides and the trenches, Earth rehearsed the idea of sequence. The idea that one thing could follow another. That this could lead to that. And from that, something more. Still, there was no place to arrive. The waves ran forever. No reef to end against. No bay to calm into. The early ocean had no maps, no edge, no frame to rest its story upon. And so it made its own. In layers, in sediment, in deep, slow swirls that left traces not in stone, but in temperature, in trace elements, in isotopic whispers now buried in the record. When geologists speak of these oceans, they do so with a kind of reverence. They speak of the Hadean and the Eoarchean as if the names themselves are fossils. Because in truth, we don't remember these oceans in pictures. We remember them in absence, in what they never touched, in what they left no mark upon. But perhaps that, too, is a kind of fingerprint. Perhaps silence is a form of evidence. And maybe, just maybe, water remembers in ways we haven't yet learned to read. The waves that moved then are not the waves that move now, but the energy, the shape, the impulse that continues, carried forward, rewritten, echoed in every tide, in every crash and hush. Even now, when a wave folds upon itself and retreats into the sea, it's reliving something from before time was watched, before land rose, before even life dared to emerge. And if we could float there, just for a moment, in that ancient sea with no land to orient us, no stars to reflect, no wind to name, what would we feel? Would we sense the scale of it? Or would we be lost, not in fear, but in forgetting? Maybe that's what the ocean teaches, in its oldest form, that sometimes to be truly present is to have no edge at all. And yet, if water alone can shape a world without touching land, what happens when land begins to rise? Not all change is loud. Some of it comes slowly and without language. Before there was weathered rock, before anything crumbled into dust, there was a hush that stretched across the surface of the earth, a kind of stillness deeper than silence. Not because it was peaceful, but because nothing yet existed to break it. There was no soil, no humus, no mulch, no soft sediment woven with the bodies of things that once lived and then didn't. There were no fallen leaves because there were no trees, no roots to fracture the rock, no lichens to pry open a crack, no worms, no beetles, no fungi winding through shadow. Nothing died on land, because nothing had yet dared to live there. And so nothing decayed. The world above sea level, what little of it breached the ocean's endless surface, was untouched, unmarked, sterile stone, unweathered and ancient, place without memory, because without breakdown there is no layering. Without layering, no fossils. Without fossils, no story. Could it be that decay is the price of remembering? We think of rot as a kind of loss, but maybe it is also a kind of record. Maybe the world only began to keep its past once it started falling apart. In that sense, erosion might be the first form of language the land ever spoke. But before that, before even a whisper of topsoil, there was only the slow cooling of rock. Basalt, granite, peridotite, names we've given much later to surfaces that knew nothing of names. These stones didn't crumble. Not because they were stronger, but because they were untouched. Untouched by air. Untouched by life. The wind had no dust to carry, no grit to grind. The rain, when it came, ran clean across the surface, leaving no scars. It was a world before stain. Before stains became meaning. What does it feel like to exist in a time before memory? Would you know you were alone if there had never been anything to remember you? The earliest crust rose slowly, trembling with heat. It didn't yet know it was land. There were no footprints to anchor it, no creatures crawling across it, no roots seeking the cracks, no eyes to look upon it and call it beautiful. It simply existed, quietly, suspended between ocean and sky, and beneath it the mantle shifted. Always, slowly, always. Beneath that, the core roared, its churning invisible but constant. The interior of Earth was not still. It boiled and heaved and moved as if dreaming. But at the surface, where that heat should have spoken its story, there was only silence. A silence made not of absence, but of delay. Geologists speak of this time as the pre-soil world, the abiotic crust, an age where the only breakdown was mechanical. A rock split by temperature change, a fragment worn smooth by tide. Chemistry was possible, yes. The minerals danced in quiet reaction. But there was no biology to amplify it. No cells to eat and be eaten. No enzymes to whisper, faster. There are no fossils from this time. Not because it is unimportant, but because there was nothing to leave behind. No bones, no shells, no organic trace to press itself into clay and hold shape long after the source dissolved. Only rock, plain, unyielding. And because of that, most of what we know about this era comes from indirect signs. Ratios of isotopes trapped in zircon. The oxygen fingerprint of ancient rain. The faint suggestion of a volcanic ash layer, formed when the air held no trees to burn. So much of Earth's story lies in what it has forgotten. And perhaps this is what makes the long silence before soil so haunting. It was not empty. It was full. Full of unexpressed potential. Full of places that life would someday reach. Full of stories that had not yet begun to write themselves. Maybe we can't find traces from this time because the world had no reason yet to preserve. Memory, after all, is costly. To remember means to carry. To carry means to wear down. And to wear down means to die. So perhaps this early Earth chose to wait. Not because it was passive, but because it was patient. And when the time did come, when the first molecules of carbon met the first hints of life, everything began to change. Slowly, quietly, but irreversibly. Erosion took its first breath. Rot learned its first rhythm. And in the tiny cracks of cooling stone, the planet began to keep its history. But before all of that, it was still. And not still as in unmoving, but still as in unbroken. Still as in whole. Still as in waiting. And yet, if even decay became a kind of memory, what might have happened to the memories that came before it? The world had no edges, yet it rippled. No mountains yet stood, and still the ground moved. Long before continents carved themselves from fire and float, the earth had already learned how to shift. It folded itself not because it had shape, but because it had breath, the kind of breath that rises from pressure, slow and invisible, waiting for release. Underneath the crust, molten rock stirred with restless energy. The mantle, deep and unseen, coiled in great convection loops, like slow-motion waves beneath a frozen lake. Nothing rushed, nothing needed to. Heat did not escape all at once. It whispered upward through ancient fractures, through gaps that weren't quite gaps, through softness that wasn't yet weakness. Earth, even then, was practicing imperfection. There were no borders. No clear dividing lines between one slab and another. But there were differences, variations. densities that tilted, temperatures that nudged one layer beneath another. And so began the first gestures of subduction, not as violence, but as gravity's slow suggestion. One piece of seafloor slid beneath another, not with force, but with surrender. Not because it was broken, but because it was heavier. We think of subduction now as the engine of continents. But in those ancient days it was not building land, it was erasing it. Oceanic plates were born and buried in silence. A cycle with no beginning, no end. Crust would form at a mid-ocean ridge, travel slowly across the seafloor, then sink back into the planet's mantle like a forgotten letter, unopened and unremembered. Could it be that Earth was writing to itself? Could it be that subduction was not a mechanism, but a message? Maybe, maybe not. There are no witnesses from that time. No fossils to record the motion. No soil to trap the heat print. Only hints remain. Fragments of ancient crust found in the strangest places. Tiny crystals bearing isotope ratios that shouldn't exist. Echoes of vanished rock, caught in the folds of younger mountains. They speak of a world already restless. A world already folding. And folding is, in its own way, a kind of memory. Not a memory of image or sound, but of stress, of compression, of tension released slowly enough to leave a scar. The early Earth did not need continents to move. It only needed imbalance. Hot things rise, cold things sink. Given enough time, even stone begins to flow. And when that flow thickens, one edge begins to bend. One sheet begins to slip beneath another. And deep below, that edge melts, not quickly but gradually, becoming mantle once more, becoming part of the interior's breath. This is the cycle that would one day make mountains, one day make earthquakes, one day separate seas from land, life from lifelessness. But not yet. Back then it was a quieter dance, a choreography without audience. And yet a movement leaves a trace, even when it's slow. Subduction zones cool the mantle in ribbons. They mark where Earth has exhaled. Seismic waves travel differently through those places, rippling slightly offbeat, like sound bouncing through uneven walls. Scientists have traced these anomalies like ghost lines, buried hundreds of kilometers below the crust. The sunken remains of early plates, now suspended in the deep. They call it the mantle graveyard. But maybe it's more like a library. Maybe those sunken slabs still hold messages. Maybe they remember their path. Not because they think, but because they cooled in patterns. Because their atoms aligned in the moment of descent. Because nothing erases heat cleanly. It lingers, it echoes, it hums. And so Earth, long before the continents arrived, was already keeping rhythm. Already balancing itself through movement. Already folding its outer skin to vent the fire inside. Not because it was unstable, but because it was alive. Not because something was broken, but because everything was beginning. And yet, if a planet can fold without borders, if it can erase itself before it ever builds, then what else might it have created and quietly taken back? Even as the seafloor slipped and sank beneath itself, above it, the air told a different story. One not carved in rock, but whispered in chemistry. A sky without roots, a world without leaves. And yet, the air was not empty. It moved, it churned. It wrapped the young Earth in a cloak of unseen potential, thick, heavy, and untamed. There were no trees to breathe it in, no mosses clinging to stone, no ferns coiled in shade. Life had not yet learned to reach upward. All photosynthesis was underwater, slow and microbial, folded into mats of ancient cyanobacteria. Little blue-green whispers clinging to warm shallows. Their breath was oxygen, but their audience was small. For millions of years, their exhale went unnoticed, or perhaps uninvited. The atmosphere, as we know it, had not yet arrived. The air was a stew of earlier things, methane from vents, carbon dioxide from volcanoes, ammonia, water vapor, sulfuric mists. Gases born from rock, not from root. It was a sky of ghosts, not silent, but unspeaking. Not poisonous, but wild. The kind of air that changes you if you breathe it too long. The kind of air that forgets. What if oxygen was always here, just hidden? What if it flickered in and out like a memory? Present, then lost, then born again. Maybe, maybe not. The geologic record does not hold air in its hands. But it holds clues. Tiny isotopes frozen in minerals, banded iron formations laid down in ancient seas, red beds signaling a shift from anoxic to oxidized. Tells us that oxygen came in pulses. First a whisper, then a lull, a gasp, then stillness. It did not arrive like a sunrise. It arrived like a rumor. Oxygen's early presence was not a promise. It was a test. It rusted the ocean first, binding with dissolved iron until the seas bled red, staining the seabed with layered deposits. Time measured not in fossils, but in iron. Only once that process was spent, only once the ocean had forgotten how to absorb more, could oxygen rise into the air. And when it did, it was still not welcome. Methane and carbon dioxide dominated then, warming the planet in a sun that was weaker, dimmer than today's. The greenhouse veil kept the oceans from freezing solid. Protective accident. A dangerous gift. If oxygen pushed too far, methane retreated, and Earth cooled. Snowball Earth may have been the price of too much breath. And yet oxygen kept coming. Not because it was needed, but because it was inevitable. Because life was stubborn. Because light kept falling on water, and water kept giving up electrons. And every time that happened, a molecule of O2 escaped. Invisible. Waiting. Accumulating. But trees were still far away. Forests a fantasy. There was no bark, no wood, no branching limbs to catch sunlight in wide, green fans. The Earth's lungs hadn't grown yet. It exhaled slowly through mats and filaments, through soft scum on tidal rocks, through floating colonies barely visible, drifting in currents. Could we call it air if nothing breathed it? Could we call it sky if no creature looked up? Even then, the winds existed. Jet streams and pressure belts, planetary spin carving the sky into bands. But with no land to break the flow, no mountains to stir the pattern, it was smoother, stranger. The early winds may have stretched for thousands of kilometers without interruption. Clean, unshaped rivers of gas moving above a planet wrapped in sea. No pollen danced in it. No birds. No spores, no seeds, no drifting leaves. Only dust from volcanoes, salt from waves, and chemicals lofted from the ocean's breath. Still, it changed. Not quickly, but meaningfully. The composition of the air was not fixed. It was negotiated. Between mantle and ocean, between microbe and mineral, between heat and entropy, there was no ozone yet to block ultraviolet light. The atmosphere thinned toward space without the familiar curtain of protection. Sunlight rained down differently, slicing the upper layers with radiation that today would sterilize. But life, clever and small, stayed low, tucked beneath the water's skin, shielded by depth. And as the gases shifted, so too did the possibilities. Somewhere between the methane haze and the oxygen trickle, new molecules began to dance. Complex ones, fragile ones, chains of carbon that curled and twisted. Organic compounds that hinted barely at future invention. Maybe not life itself, but the grammar of life. A language the Earth was still learning to speak. We may never know how the first whispers of breathable air came to be, whether it was sudden or slow, whether it came from heat or hunger, but we know it mattered, because once the balance tilted, once the sky began to carry more oxygen than it consumed, everything changed. The surface of the planet became something new, not overnight but over eons. Trees would one day rise to inhale it. Animals would one day race to burn it. But in this chapter, there were no lungs, only air, wild, unpredictable, full of secrets. And yet, if there was a time when the sky was too thick for forests, too strange for breath, then how many other atmospheres has Earth forgotten? Some stories never make it to stone. They are lived briefly in warmth and in motion, and then vanish. Not because they were unimportant, but because the world had no place to keep them. No shelves, no silt, no silence deep enough to seal them away. These were the lives that rose and dissolved beneath the waves, soft, unarmored, unnamed. Before there were forests, before jaws or shells or skeletons, there were only cells. Slippery, translucent, quiet. They moved through water not with limbs, but with luck. They fed on light or on each other or on ancient chemistry left over from Earth's warmer, molten days. They were not large enough to see, but they were there, breathing, dividing, dying, waiting, and when they died, they drifted. No one buried them, no sand tucked them in. No river laid them down in layers. Instead, their bodies fell gently into a dark that did not keep. In the deep oceans, decay ruled. Bacteria feasted, pressure flattened, and the slow churn of plate tectonics recycled everything that could have been remembered. The cradle erased its child, not out of cruelty, but because the seabed was still learning how to forget. Fossils, as we know them, are rare even now. They are not the rule but the exception. Perfect storm of luck and timing. Something dies in the right place at the right depth under just enough sediment, and even then, it is a game of patience. It can take tens of thousands of years for a bone to turn to stone. But in the ancient oceans, that patience had no partner. There were no bones to begin with, no teeth, no coral reefs, only film-thin organisms and the occasional mat of microbial life clinging to a rock that itself would dissolve. What if there were entire kingdoms of life we will never know existed? Not because they are hidden, but because they left no trace? Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes, scientists find hints. Strange carbon signatures in ancient rocks. Unusual patterns in iron or sulfur isotopes. Layered structures called stromatolites, built by communities of microbes long ago, one of the few survivors from that pre-fossil age. Not a body but a behavior, not a face but a fingerprint. And yet, even these are rare, easily crushed, easily lost. It is possible that the earliest ecosystems were complex in ways we cannot imagine, but soft in ways we cannot see. That the greatest bloom of life in early Earth story was one that wrote nothing down. The records were made of jelly, of film, of breath, and all of it washed away. In a way, this kind of erasure is natural. Entropy waits for everything. Decay is not a failure, but a return. But still, there is something mournful about lives so completely forgotten. We like to think of memory as permanent, as preserved in layers. But memory, too, is fragile. It requires a witness, a stillness, a shape, and for a very long time the earth was not still. The crust cracked, oceans boiled and cooled. Subduction dragged seabeds downward, pulling their stories into the mantle, where pressure and heat dissolved all trace. Maybe a few molecules remained, maybe not. There are no headlines written in magma, only heat, only churn. We stand now in a world built on these erased beginnings. Our continents, our coastlines, our soil, all laid down after. We live in a fossil-rich age, surrounded by stone memories of teeth and trunks and trilobites. But these are the chapters that made it through the fire. Not the prologue, not the earliest dreams. Could it be that life began 1,000 times, and was lost 1,000 more? Could the sea have told stories to itself over and over, only to lose the words each time the current shifted? In the end, what survives is often not what matters most. It is what happens to survive. And that is different. Survival is not the same as significance. Sometimes the quietest lives shape the loudest futures, even if they are never found. And yet, if these soft lives shaped the chemistry of the sea, if they gave rise to oxygen, to minerals, to the conditions that allowed for later forms to flourish, then aren't they part of every fossil that came after? Maybe their legacy is not in form, but in function. Not in imprint, but in influence. Not remembered, but felt. And yet, if the ocean could forget that much life, what else might it be hiding? There was a time when the ocean had no memory of edges, no margins, no interruption, just depth and sway, echo and flow, a silence that folded itself endlessly into itself. But then a bulge, a breath, a ripple in the symmetry. Somewhere beneath that ancient ocean skin, a crack opened, and heat rose. Not in fury, not in haste, but in a slow, steady push. Magma, pulsing upward, met cold seawater and froze again and again and again. And over time, the sea gave way to something else. Not land as we know it, but beginnings. The first islands were not grand. They did not tower. They did not bloom with green. They were raw. Black stone, sharp edges, steaming vents. Volcanic ghosts that broke the surface only to be swallowed again. Ephemeral like thoughts, like sparks. But in those brief moments above the waves, something changed. The ocean, once the only world, met a fragment of something foreign. And the sky, used to looking down on motion, met stillness. What does it mean when the world invents a place to stand? We do not know how many of these islands came and went before the continents even thought of rising. We only know that they were many, and that most are gone, subducted, erased, crumbled under the weight of time and tectonics. But maybe, not forgotten. Maybe the mantle remembers. Maybe some of those lost islands left behind chemical signatures, faint trails of zircon or isotopic ratios in ocean crust. Maybe, in places we've never drilled, lie the remnants of these ancient islands. Their roots sunk deep into the crust, still humming with heat. They weren't homes. Not yet. There was nothing on them but rock, and perhaps the thin mist of seawater evaporating in the sun. But even lifeless, they mattered, because they made the first horizon. They cast the first shadows. They interrupted the endless motion of waves, forcing currents to bend, to change, to swirl. They carved chaos into order. They created pockets of difference. And difference is how life begins. Could it be that in the shelter of these stony flickers, some ancient microbe clung to the surface and found, not comfort, but pause? A place where sun and mineral and water met in just the right way, at just the right moment to offer the spark of something new. Not because the island intended it, but because the island existed. These volcanic peaks did not last. The mantle shifted. The ocean swallowed. Some sank slowly, becoming seamounts, mountains beneath the sea, now hidden but once proud. Others exploded and vanished, and some merged, forming larger masses, the faint fingerprints of proto-continents, still years, eons, epochs from becoming true land. But even if they vanished, the possibility they introduced did not. An island is not just land. It is a threshold, a space between realms. And long before forests rose, before soils formed, before oxygen bloomed into breathable skies, the earth practiced the idea of land. It tried. It reached. It failed. And it tried again. That too is geology. That too is memory. The first islands held no trees, but they dreamed of them. They held no creatures, but they dreamed of crawling things. They knew no names, but they shaped the future of names to come. Each time one rose, it whispered into the sea. What if this is enough? What if life could stand here someday? Not because life was ready, but because the invitation had been made. And then erosion. Even before rivers or wind, the ocean began its work. Crashing, raking, wearing down those jagged edges into softer curves. And already, even without soil, the idea of decay had entered the planet's vocabulary. Entropy had found its footing. The memory of stone was being written and rewritten by water. Some islands fused with others. Some disappeared forever. Some became the cores of larger structures. Others fractured. Each left behind a different story, a different shape. And every one of them, every temporary surface, expanded the vocabulary of the earth. If the sea once knew only motion, these islands introduced pause. If life once knew only drift, these islands introduced destination. They were not yet home, but they hinted that home could be possible. And yet, if such fragile fragments could stir the planet's imagination, what else might have been stirred beneath the waves? Still unseen, still unfolding, still waiting? The islands had begun to rise, had begun to vanish. But even before they stitched themselves into continents, something ancient and invisible may have stirred in response. Not in the skies, not in the stone, but deep in the water's breath. Something smaller, something soft, life not as creatures not yet but as cells, as threads of presence, as whispers in warm brine, suspended in the ocean's endless embrace. Could it be that these single-celled wanderers, ancient and unknowing, were already listening? Not with ears, not with thought, but with a kind of molecular intuition, a rhythm of movement, a slow recognition of change. They floated in a sea that had no shore, beneath skies that had never been filtered by forest, over a world without pattern. And yet, something was shifting. Beneath them, the crust murmured, the mantle pulsed, the sea itself lifted in tides not driven by the moon, but by heat. And in the water, life moved with it. Microbes do not remember the way we do. They carry no language, no myths, and yet, they respond. To light, to heat, to motion. Some cluster near hydrothermal vents, where chemistry spills like breath from the planet's lungs. Others drift upward, chasing the glint of early sunlight across silted waves. But what if, even then, they sensed something deeper? What if they clustered near rising islands not by chance, but by attraction? Not because they knew what was coming, but because the earth itself was beginning to gather meaning. Maybe the early islands didn't just rise into the sea. Maybe they summoned the plumes of minerals, the gradients of heat, the quiet turbulence of oceanic upwelling. All of it could have drawn life near, not for refuge but for opportunity. Not because land was safe, it wasn't, but because it was new, and life is drawn to change. Could it be that in the lull between volcanic bursts, some microbe settled into a crevice of basalt, clinging not with limbs but with chemistry? That it tasted the shift, the trace minerals, the ion trails left by an emerging island? Did it sense the warm rock beneath and the colder sea above, and react not with fear but with replication? Geology is slow, life too when it begins, but across millions of years, even slowness becomes choreography. As plates shifted beneath the sea, new vents opened. As magma cooled, new surfaces formed. The earth was writing its first rough draft of terrain, not as destination but as experiment. And in this watery laboratory, life responded. Slowly, patiently, in microbial mats that clung to submarine ridges, in films that coated ancient lava flows, in invisible dances of protein and salt, evolving in silence. There are no fossils from this time, no bones, no leaves, no shells, but perhaps there are chemical ghosts, in the isotopic trails of ancient carbon, in the trapped sulfur ratios of ancient seafloor, in the locked gases of ancient zircons, fragments of a time when life was not visible, but still present, watching, listening, becoming, not because it had purpose, but because it could. Maybe the earliest listeners were not even fully alive by our standards. Maybe they were pre-life, proto-life, chemical potentials that oscillated with the rhythms of a changing sea. Maybe they replicated without awareness, adapted without design, and yet somehow followed the heat, followed the cracks, followed the signs that the world beneath them was shifting. Could life, in its earliest stirrings, have tracked the patterns of plate motion before there were maps? Could it have mirrored the slow fold of Earth's skin with its own slow unfolding? There's no way to be sure, but we know that life always finds the gradients, the edges between hot and cold, light and dark, acid and base. And what are tectonic beginnings if not gradients writ large? Crust forming, crust sinking, energy flowing, and life drawn to the boundaries, not because it wanted to explore, but because that's where survival was richest. Even now, in modern vents and seafloor ridges, life thrives in chaos. It listens not with consciousness but with form. Its membranes adapt, its enzymes shift. It tunes itself to the Earth's fluctuations like a chord echoing a deeper note. So maybe the first listeners were tuning themselves too. Maybe life didn't wait for land to evolve. Maybe it was already preparing, not by looking ahead, but by responding to the breath of rock beneath its watery sky. The islands were temporary, but life is persistent. And even if no fossil marks those early listeners, No trace etched in stone, the memory may remain. Past not in monuments, but in molecules. A resonance. A memory encoded not in language, but in response. So we ask again, was life already listening? Not with ears, but with everything it was. And if it was, what else might it have heard, just before the earth began to rise? If life was already listening, it was doing so in a world without reference. A planet adrift in its own becoming, marked not by monuments or memories, but by rhythm. Quiet, continuous, endless rhythm. And in this world, time moved not as something seen, but as something felt. Not in the way we track it now with clocks and calendars and the long shadows of architecture, but in heat, in motion, in invisible decay. Time in those days had no surface. There were no trees to mark the seasons with their rings. No valleys deepened by rivers. No shorelines pulled back and forth by predictable moons. The earth had no scars to read, no calendar etched into stone. It had only the ticking of atoms, silent, invisible, unceasing, radioactive isotopes, locked inside minerals, quietly shifting their state. Uranium decaying to lead, potassium changing to argon, as if the very bones of the planet were counting down in a language no eye could see. A timekeeper without audience, a clock buried not above, but beneath. And so time passed, slowly, vastly, without witness. Not because nothing was happening, but because there were no landmarks to hold it. Could it be that time itself was softer then? Not in pace but in perception. That without land, without the friction of rising stone or falling tree, the very shape of memory was different. Maybe without mountains to crumble or valleys to deepen erosion, that grand storyteller of the earth had no script to write. Decay needs form to act upon. And so, in a world of water and fire, there was change, but little residue. Few marks, almost no trace. And yet, even in the silence, cycles stirred. The ocean, vast and structureless, still moved in slow pulses. Beneath its surface, heat rose and cooled. Salinity shifted. Currents churned not randomly, but with purpose, echoing the slow breath of mantle beneath. A kind of planetary heartbeat, a metronome of temperature and chemistry, long before continents rose to fracture it. Could time have lived in those cycles? Not written in stone, but dissolved in brine? Could the pulse of ocean overturning be the ancient predecessor to geological timekeeping, a kind of watery memory, flowing but not forgotten? There were no coastlines to trace its rhythm, no coral shelves to archive its changes, and yet, sediment still fell, even in the deep, even without land. Microscopic rain, organic remains, volcanic dust, elemental ash, settled to the seafloor like time made tangible, layer by layer, grain by grain, each flake, a whisper of a moment, each deposit, a word in an invisible story. And beneath it all, the crust aged, slowly, inevitably, as new rock formed at mid-ocean ridges and drifted outward. The seabed carried with it the quiet tattoo of time. The farther from the ridge, the older the rock, the cooler, the deeper, the more burdened by memory. Even without continents, there were timelines just hidden in motion, rather than form. But for the earliest life, what did time mean? Did it feel the difference between a minute and a millennium? Did it drift differently in younger waters? Could early microbes sense the age of a vent, the freshness of the crust it leaked through? Did they evolve faster in the chaos, or more gently in the calm? We do not know, but we know that time passed, that radioactive decay continued, even in the dark, that isotopes transformed, indifferent to the lack of land, and that somewhere, deep below, the mantle swirled, carrying heat from core to crust in slow, convective spirals, shaping not space, but time itself. Not because it wanted to measure, but because the earth even then was changing, and change is what makes time real. Without landmarks, we imagine time as soft, unfixed, but perhaps it was more absolute than ever, steady, even sacred, held not in memory, but in the marrow of minerals, in the breath of water, in the transformation of unseen elements. And maybe, just maybe, the silence of that world wasn't the absence of history, but the beginning of it, a kind of pre-memory, waiting for land to rise, waiting for something solid enough to remember. And yet, if this much can unfold without a trace, what else might we have forgotten? And if memory had no pages to write on, perhaps the earth was already learning to carry its story not on the surface, but within. While the seas turned gently above, quiet as breath and just as persistent, a different drama churned below, not loud but deep. The Hadean earth, some 4.5 billion years ago, was not a hellscape in the way we imagine it. Not just fire, not just chaos, it was something slower, stranger, a kind of sorting. Heat, left over from the planet's birth, had not yet found its rhythm. It pulsed and pooled in wild gradients, not because it was angry, but because it was young. The Earth had only recently formed, not in silence but through impact. A collision with a Mars-sized body, Theia, had left a molten wound, one that would eventually become the Moon, and left the rest of the Earth to cool, to settle, to separate. Iron, the heaviest of elements born in the hearts of ancient stars, did not rise. It fell. Through magma, through slurry, through early rock, it drifted downward, slow and inevitable, pulled by gravity and guided by entropy. Maybe it did not know why it sank. Maybe it didn't need to, but as it moved, it transformed the planet. Formed a core, a center, a place of weight and whisper and warmth. Not just a mass of metal but a cradle of magnetism, a shield that would someday protect. But not yet. Not then. Above it, lighter elements began to rise. Silica, oxygen, aluminum, materials less dense, more patient, drifted upward, forming the first suggestions of crust. But this crust was not like today's continents. It was thin, broken, fragile as skin on cooling soup, cracked easily. It melted often. It did not float like land. It wavered like thought. And still the planet breathed. Convection currents surged through the mantle, vast and curling, carrying heat away from the core in broad, spiraling arcs. These currents were not aimless. They were a kind of planetary exhale, a deep release of inner tension, flowing not to escape but to balance. And in this balance something strange began to form, layering, not all at once but gradually. Just as dreams assemble out of fragments, the earth began to self-organize. Not by design but by behavior. Dense sank, light rose, fluid congealed, rock recrystallized. It was a time of beginnings, though nothing had yet taken form. There were no rivers, no sky as we know it, no continents, only differentiation, a slow decision made by minerals and time. What if the planet's earliest intelligence was this? Not thought but sorting, not mind but memory made physical. A planet learning how to be a planet, not through invention, but through gravity, temperature, and silence. Could it be that everything we now walk upon, every mountain range and ancient shore, owes its existence to this unspoken phase shift in the Earth's infancy? Perhaps the most important parts of our world were never built, but separated. The crust that would someday support life was forged not in eruption, but in buoyancy. It floated not by choice, but because it could not sink. And in this floating, the stage was set, not for life not yet, but for the land that life would someday reach. And beneath that floating crust, iron still glowed. The core, hidden from sight and unreachable even now, began to swirl, not all at once. Slowly, viscously, but as it spun, it created something unprecedented. A magnetic field, planetary hum, a future pulse that would guard fragile molecules from the chaos of space. A signal that would guide birds later, and seeds, and cells, and ships. But here, in the Hadean, it was only a whisper. The field was forming. The mantle was turning. The crust was rising. And yet, nothing had begun, not really. The earth was still becoming. And in becoming, it was forgetting, for there are no rocks from this time. Not really. Most have melted, subducted, erased. What we know of the Hadean comes from rare zircons, tiny crystals, smaller than grains of sand, holding clues in their isotopes. They tell us of water, of temperature, of pressure, but not of certainty. The Hadean is the Earth's first forgotten chapter, not because it lacked meaning, but because it left almost nothing behind. And maybe that's how foundations work. Not because they endure, but because they allow what follows to form. And yet, if this much was made and lost before land ever rose, what else might be buried beneath our feet, waiting to speak? Not every story unfolds in motion. Some stretch out in stillness. For a time so long it loses shape in the mind, the earth rested in a kind of suspension. A lull in the planet's breath. Not death, not sleep, just pause. The seas above rolled endlessly across a surface without edges. Beneath them, convection whispered in secret rhythms. Not silent, but subdued. A world between moments, a world between selves. Maybe it was too hot. Maybe not hot enough. Maybe the pressures weren't right. Maybe the light from the young sun hadn't yet balanced with the dark inside. Or maybe, just maybe, this pause was necessary. The same way a seed rests before germinating. The way snow hangs in air before falling. A quiet steeped in purpose, even if that purpose could not yet be named. There were no mountains yet. No cliffs to hold shadows. No rivers to cut paths through stone. There was only magma, slowly thickening under pressure, and an ocean that waited above it like breath waiting for speech. For hundreds of millions of years, that's all there was. Heat rising, water moving, a pressure building, not because of anything wrong, but because something was about to shift. Some scientists call it the boring billion, a stretch of geologic time when very little changed, at least from our distant human view. But that quiet may not have been boring at all. It may have been sacred. In that stillness, the earth was arranging its memory. Temperatures slowly dropped. The outer layers thickened. The inner layers stirred. Currents in the mantle moved in wide spirals, not just churning heat but crafting the subtlest tectonic premonitions. There are traces of these stirrings still, locked deep in zircon crystals older than mountains, older than soil. Could it be the planet was learning patience? There is something strange about this pause, not because it was empty, but because it was so full of heat, of pressure, of potential. Subduction had begun, quietly, beneath the waves. Crust melting back into mantle, mantle melting back to crust. A long recycling of stone and heat with no eyes to witness. A slow ballet without an audience. But even dances need stillness between their steps. During this stretch of time, the continents did not yet exist, not as we know them. There were hints, fragments, rafts of proto-crust drifting alone like thoughts waiting to find meaning. Some sank again into the sea. Some dissolved. A few endured, for a while, becoming the first dry specks in a world without shores. But they did not last. Not yet. Not fully. It was as though the earth was still unsure of when, of how, of why it should lift land from water. Could a planet hesitate? Maybe this was more than temperature. More than time. Maybe the earth was waiting for a different kind of balance. A tension between loss and return, between gravity and lift. For hundreds of millions of years, the ocean had ruled. Its waves traced no borders. Its tides wrote no names. But something beneath was listening, gathering strength, gathering certainty. In the dark silence of the deep mantle, minerals rearranged themselves. Elements diffused. Radioactive isotopes decayed, shedding heat, changing pressure. These were not fast changes. They did not scream or glow. They barely moved. But over time, they built something impossible to see. Until one day, land began to rise. Not all at once, but in fragments like thoughts remembered. But that part comes later. Here, in this pause, the earth is still waiting. Oceans steam, but do not boil. Mantles convect, but do not rupture. Time stretches, a ribbon uncut. It's a mystery that geology cannot quite answer. Why so long? Why so still? Was it chance? Or ritual? Maybe all beginnings need a still place to emerge from. Maybe continents are not born from chaos, but from contemplation. And if that's true, if this long hush was not delay but design, then what wisdom was laid down in that silence? What codes etched into the way heat rose and cooled, into the way mineral met mineral beneath kilometers of sea? We may never know, but there are times, in the deepest layers of Earth's crust, when we find scars not from violence, but from waiting. Faint isotope signatures, unusual pressure patterns, ghosts of time stretched too thin. Maybe land didn't rise until the Earth was ready to remember itself. Maybe there was something sacred in the pause. And yet, if the planet can wait this long to lift its skin, if it can hold its breath through heat and time and silence, what else might it still be waiting to unfold? There is a kind of remembering that doesn't happen in the mind, but in matter. It begins in pieces, drifting, fragmented, bits of early crust, lighter than the mantle, but heavier than the sea, floating like forgotten thoughts. Not land, not yet, not even islands, just ancient stones, scattered by subduction and uplift, by eruptions that whispered more than they roared. They moved with the currents below, bobbing slowly above the mantle's slow and endless breath. These fragments did not know each other, but something in them resonated. They circled, spiraled, drifted closer. Not quickly, not consciously, but persistently, as though something inside the Earth had decided to gather. One piece, then another, the third, then more. Over millions of years, their distances shrank, their temperatures shifted. They thickened where they touched, melded under pressure. They fused not in fire, but in patience. This was not yet a continent. It was not land as we know it, but it was a beginning, the first whisper of permanence, the seed of togetherness, the memory of mass. We call them supercratons, proto-continents that came before continents, ancient cores, deep and old and strange. Their names come later, Uar, Vulbara, perhaps even Zimgarn, but their shapes are older than names. They formed in a world without blue skies, without forests, without soil. A world lit by a harsher sun and cloaked in thicker air. But beneath that sky, in the slow heat of the mantle, something new was stirring, a desire to cohere, not because of will, but because of imbalance. Heat seeks escape, mass seeks rest. The lightest crust, forged by ancient volcanism, refused to sink. Instead, it gathered, and as it gathered, it grew strong. Strong enough to resist, strong enough to stay afloat. Could it be that continents are just the result of things trying not to drown? Beneath the surface, the Earth was not still. Subduction carried slabs of crust downward. Mantle plumes pushed upward in return. Where plumes met cratons, domes rose and cracked. Where plates collided, roots formed, deep keels of rigid lithosphere, anchoring floating stones into the convection's flow. The more they fused, the more they resisted. And the more they resisted, the longer they survived. These weren't clean unions. They were sutured, weathered, incomplete. The scars of their formation run deep into the rock, zones of weakness, crushed minerals, twisted metamorphic seams. But scars are a kind of memory too. They tell us something happened, something endured. In the geologic record we find hints. Tiny zircon crystals, their isotope ratios echoing ancient melting events. Faint magnetic signatures, frozen in basalt, revealing the direction of a field that once reversed and trembled. Oxygen levels fluctuating, iron oxidizing, oceans subtly shifting in their chemistry. All of it happening while these supercratons formed, pressed together not by design, but by gravity, heat, and time. Maybe they didn't know what they were becoming. Maybe no beginning does. And yet, there is something haunting about this phase in Earth's memory. These floating fragments, alone for so long, now learning the shape of togetherness. Maybe not because they had to, but because they could. The boundaries between them were not sharp, not like today's plates. They were gentle, gradual, like the edge of a thought not yet spoken. As the supercraton grew, it changed everything. Thickened the crust, altered heat flow, redirected convection cells. It reshaped not just the surface but the inside of the Earth. And with that reshaping came new volcanism, new gases, new cycles of rock and air and water. The oceans, once unbroken, now met with edges. Rising shelves, submerged plateaus, undersea cliffs. Even if no life walked the land, the sea felt the shift. Could microbes sense it? The deep-dwelling archaea in hydrothermal vents, the cyanobacteria tracing filaments in shallow seas. Could they feel the pull of changing tides? The subtle uplift of stone beneath their world? Maybe, maybe not. But what is land if not memory risen from the deep? These early supercratons may have been short-lived by geologic standards. They came together, then broke apart, then reassembled in new ways at new angles. They did not stay whole, but they gave birth to patterns, to possibilities. Their fragments, now hidden in the roots of modern continents, still carry the echoes of that first gathering. The Earth remembers in stones, and those stones, once lost and drifting, became a skeleton on which futures could be built. The foundations for soil, for mountains, for life, not because they intended to, but because they lasted. And yet, if these early supercratons formed so quietly, fused so slowly, and broke so softly, how many others might have risen and vanished before we learned how to look? It didn't happen with a crash, or a roar, or a thunderclap. There was no single moment, no definitive crest. Just a slow lifting, a swelling, a shift so quiet it may have gone unloved by time itself. And yet it happened. One rise among many rose a little higher. The craton held firm. It held long enough, strong enough to break the waterline. The ocean, endless, borderless, eternal, had never known interruption. It moved in rhythm with itself. It carried minerals and microbes and forgotten heat from pole to pole, without need for edge or end. But now something interrupted that flow. A shallow slope. A lip of rock. A shore. Imagine the stillness of that first meeting. No witness. No footsteps. No eyes to watch it happen. Just salt water greeting dry stone. A hush between them. A pause that rippled outward through pressure and current and time. Maybe the ocean didn't know what to make of this newcomer. Maybe it didn't care. But from that meeting onward, nothing would ever be the same. Because a shoreline changes everything. Waves, once free to roll and stretch without resistance, now crashed, broke, curled back upon themselves in surprise. The sea, which had never needed to retreat, began to do so. Tides, once symmetrical, now learned asymmetry. The wind, dragging low over this roughness, gained new textures. Currents bent. Patterns rebalanced. The Earth learned how to divide. Not because it had to, but because it could. On this first shore, this ridge, this seam between water and sky, the planet learned something new: contrast. Wet and dry, soft and hard, change and stillness. And with contrast comes potential. Could it be that life itself waited for contrast? The land did not rush to expand. It lingered, hesitant, at the edge of submersion. Some parts sank back into the sea. Others fractured, cracked, or broke apart entirely. But a few remained, anchored by depth, rooted by pressure, a bulge of memory, a breath held just long enough. And with time, the shoreline evolved. No longer just a line, now a shape, a jagged edge, a map not yet drawn but already alive. The air changed too. Where water met warmth, mist rose. Clouds began to drift differently. Rain behaved strangely over land. Some minerals oxidized. Some gases clung to dry surface instead of slipping back into sea. And if the wind remembered the moment it first struck land, what song did it carry? The atmosphere, thick and unruly, now traced over something new. The contours of land gave rise to pressure gradients, subtle winds, swirling cells. These movements would later become climate, storms, even jet streams. But at the beginning, they were just whispers, whispering over stone, testing the shape of what would come next. Could early microbes have clung to this new surface? Could pools have formed in craters? Could mineral deposits from waves have seeded the chemistry of life? Or perhaps Perhaps not yet. Perhaps it was enough for now just to have surface. Something to hold the sky up. Something for gravity to love. And yet, it's strange to think. There was a time when Earth didn't have a shore. A time when here and there were meaningless. When the whole planet was one fluid field, with no verticality, no resting place, no margin. A time when everything moved, but nothing stayed. Entropy for a moment met resistance, and that resistance was land. The first shoreline would not last. Erosion would grind it down. Heat would melt it. Subduction would reclaim it. Even now, there are almost no rocks left from that beginning. But in the record we find trace hints. Ancient zircon crystals, older than memory, nestled in younger stone. Oxygen isotopes hinting at interaction with liquid water. A tiny shift in chemistry that says, softly, this once stood above the sea. It was not a fortress. It was not a promise. But it was a beginning. Maybe all land is born from this paradox, that to rise is to risk. That to touch the sky is to invite weather, to invite decay. The moment the ocean found a shore, the process of erosion began. And in a strange way, that erosion made memory possible. For only things that endure, even while fading, can be remembered. And if land remembers the moment it rose, does the ocean remember the moment it let go? We don't know what shape that first continent took. It might have been narrow, or round, or shattered. It may have risen in silence and fallen just as quietly. But it was enough to begin a pattern. Enough to make the planet's surface unequal. Enough to ripple a path toward future shores, future homes, future stories. And yet, if this much can be changed by the simple presence of a shoreline, what else began the moment land first kissed air? The ocean had met land. A shoreline had formed. But above it, the sky still stirred with quiet storms, thick clouds laced with ancient vapors, and droplets too young to know what gravity could do. The clouds, made not of memory but of minerals evaporated long before thought, hovered over this newborn edge of Earth. And one day, maybe slowly, maybe suddenly, the sky released its breath. Raindrops fell. Not many, not fast, just a whispering descent. Cool threads falling through layers of atmosphere still heavy with heat. This was not the rain we know. It was rain untouched by life. No spores in the air, no pollen, no dust, only water, condensed from silence. And when that water met the land, something changed. There is a scent, petrichor, that we now know as the smell of rain on dry earth. But before plants, before soil, before even decay had a voice, there may have been another scent. The smell of rain on rock. A hiss, a sizzle, a wisp of vapor rising from freshly cooled crust. Stone that had waited billions of years to be touched not by ocean, but by sky. Could it be that the first rainfall did not just wash the land, but woke it? Steam curled upward in ghostly ribbons. A signal, perhaps, to the sky that the land was ready to listen. Or perhaps it was just chemistry, minerals reacting with moisture, oxygen beginning to dance with iron. These were not storms that scoured cities, nor tempests that carved valleys. They were softer, more intimate, a misting, perhaps, enough to coat the surface in glisten, enough to begin a dialogue. And in that dialogue heat met cool, solid met liquid, and something more than erosion was born, something invisible but unforgettable. Maybe the Earth's first scent. Is it possible that this was the first moment Earth began to feel itself? To hold contrast on its skin, hard and soft, wet and dry, above and below, not because it wanted to, but because the conditions had finally aligned, because something ancient had cooled just enough, and something patient had waited just long enough. Not all rocks steamed, not all lands welcomed rain. Some crumbled, some cracked, some vanished again beneath the rising tides. But somewhere one piece held, and on it the raindrops continued to fall. For days, for centuries, for epochs, and as the rain repeated, the stone remembered. Layer by layer the land began to change. Water seeped into microfractures. Minerals dissolved, reformed. Sediments began to gather in creases. And slowly, very slowly, the planet began to write, not words but textures, not language but landscape. Could it be that scent was Earth's first memory? Not a memory in mind, but in presence, a resonance, a signature. Perhaps the rain's arrival was not just a moment of chemistry, but of awareness. A note struck in the orchestra of geology, a vibration held in the hollows of stone. And if that scent had a feeling, might it have been something like belonging? Not because land had been waiting for rain, but because rain had been shaped by what it would one day meet. The two formed separately, completing each other's unfinished sentences. The sky giving water, the crust offering warmth, and in the space between them atmosphere transformed. Oxidation, dissolution, entropy, creation. The slow rearrangement of a surface no longer just passive, but responsive. Not intelligent, perhaps, but attentive. We cannot know what that first scent truly smelled like. There were no noses to catch it, no lungs to breathe it. But scent doesn't need witness to exist. It is made of molecules, of momentary collisions, of heat lifted into air. And on that primordial day, when rain found rock, it may have risen as vapor, curled as breath, and drifted into the sky as the Earth's first exhale. And yet, if water meeting land could produce a scent, a signal, a story, what other memories might this planet carry, encoded not in fossils or fossils alone, but in things even more fleeting, more elusive, like a smell rising from stone and then disappearing into air, somewhere along a new-formed shore, where molten scars had cooled and hardened into quiet stone. A film of water shimmered in the hollows of the rock. Tidal-pools, shallow, sun-warmed, forgotten by the retreating ocean. Within them something ancient stirred, not bold, not sudden, but slow, a shiver in the molecules of something that had never breathed air, but might learn how. Life until now had lived only in water, cradled in it, bound by it. It swam, it split, it multiplied in darkness and light, but always surrounded, always held. The land was something else, dry, still, exposed. It offered no obvious welcome, no nutrients, no protection, and yet something reached. A microbial strand, filament thin, drifted to the water's edge. It clung to rock, not out of ambition but out of proximity, out of chance. Maybe it didn't even notice where it was. Maybe it couldn't. But in that moment, life had crossed a threshold. The water did not pull it back. The rock did not reject it. For the first time, the stone held something soft. And over time, more followed. Not in armies, but in films. Slippery biofilms, layered with possibility. Mats of microbial community, growing in damp cracks and shaded grooves, inching upward and outward. Not because they knew the way, but because the conditions allowed it. Maybe because they were curious. Could it be that life has always been curious? That it does not seek to conquer, but to explore? Not for purpose, but for pattern. To test, to touch, to see what else might be possible. These early microbes did not build kingdoms. They left no skeletons, no teeth, no shells. Only trace, only film, but their film changed the stone. They exhaled gases, oxygen in early pulses. They secreted acids that etched into minerals. They trapped dust, caught light, held moisture. They turned lifeless crust into something reactive, responsive, alive not just above, but below. The rock began to transform not in structure but in story. Where once there was only decayless silence, now there was entropy. Not destruction but rearrangement. Stone became substrate, surface became memory, and those earliest colonies, those soft breathers on brittle ground, they began to paint the land in invisible strokes. We might never find them. They left no fossils, no bones to turn to stone, but we know they were there, not from bones, but from shifts, in isotopes, in elemental ratios, in the subtle fingerprints left behind by processes too slow to see. These microbes touched rock, and rock responded. That is their trace. Imagine being the first living thing to touch something permanent. Not just drift in the ocean, but anchor. Not just float, but settle. Maybe it wasn't brave. Maybe it was accidental. But even accidents can echo. And this echo would ripple outward across eons. From the first clinging film to mosses to lichens to forests. From slippery footprints to rooted groves. But here, at the beginning, there was only softness. The kind that changes everything slowly. Life did not cover the land. It whispered across it. Damp threads on dry stone. The beginning of respiration. The hint of weathering. The very first slow erosion not by water, but by life. Not because the land was ready, but because the ocean could no longer contain everything. And perhaps, neither could life itself. Could it be that even single-celled life seeks permanence? That it longs to leave behind more than itself? A mark, a film, place where it once was, not because it must, but because it can. The rock did not resist. It had waited in stillness for so long, it may not have noticed. But deep in its layers, beneath the surface, reactions had already begun. The biosphere and the lithosphere meeting for the first time, touching, not shaking hands, but listening. And that touch, silent, slow, damp with possibility, would begin to shape everything. From that first contact would one day rise forests, fungi, flowers. And yet, if life touched stone so gently, what else might it have touched that we have not yet seen? It did not begin with violence, but with softness. With rain, steady and slow, tracing the curves of newborn hills. With wind, gentle but persistent, brushing against stone as if to ask, "What are you made of?" And the land knew, unsure, freshly lifted from beneath the ocean's weight, began to respond. Not with resistance, but with release. Tiny grains, imperceptible, loosened from cliffs not yet named. A trickle became a stream. A slope became a valley. And just like that, the earth began to forget its own shape. Because to erode is not just to break, it is to remember and then release. Every particle carried away was once something whole. A rock, a ridge, a fragment of form, now surrendered to time, to water, to gravity. And yet, in that loss, something else awakened. Memory. Not the memory of minds, but the memory of movement, of presence, of having once been part of something larger. Maybe a memory began with erosion. The first deltas were not built with intent. They formed where rivers, born of rainfall and melt, grew heavy with what they had carried. Sediment, not garbage, not debris, but the soft dust of former peaks. Once tall, now level. Once bold, now silt. And when those rivers met the sea, they let go. Not because they had to, but because they could no longer hold what they had gathered. And so the deltas bloomed, slow and wide. Earth writing itself into the ocean, one layer at a time. Could it be that sediment is the planet's way of writing down what it forgets? Every layer is a sentence. Every grain a syllable. Erosion is not silence. It is story. A story told not in words, but in color, texture, pressure. We drill into cliffs and we see it. Stripes like tree rings. Strata. Compressed time. A rock becomes a memory, becomes a map. The crust begins to fold with itself, recording not just what existed, but what once fell apart. And still, it was beautiful. Even as the hills collapsed, even as shorelines retreated, the world did not mourn. Turned decay into design. Valleys grew fertile. Sediments fed life. Dust gave rise to soil. And for the first time, land was not just structure but cycle. Not a still monument, but a changing body, alive in its disintegration. Is it possible that without erosion, life could not have stepped forward? Not because erosion created life, but because it softened the way. Rock alone is too hard, too sterile, too closed. But eroded rock, warmed by sun, kissed by water, whispered to by wind, begins to yield. Crumbles. It welcomes. And from its cracks, roots might one day grow. Not yet, not now, but soon. And so innocence faded. Not in shame, but in inevitability. The earth could no longer hold itself pristine. To be touched by air and rain meant to be changed. And in that change, something else was born. The first landscapes. Not just land, but place. Deltas, cliffs, gulches, shores. Identity shaped by erosion. Not because erosion carves perfectly, but because it carves at all. What if this was always the plan? That to gain memory, something must first be lost. That to tell stories, the planet had to start letting go. Letting go of perfect stone, of untouched ridges, of unbroken silence. And in that surrender, beauty, dunes that shimmer, canyons that hum, valleys that hold fog like breath, all made from what once was whole. Maybe we, too, are shaped this way. Not by what we keep, but by what wears away. Our own memories forming in the cracks. Our stories told in layers we didn't know were building. What if we are sediments, slowly settling into the world, one experience at a time? And the dust remembers. Particles lifted into the sky, drifting for miles, across oceans, across centuries, inhaled by creatures who would never know the cliffs they came from, deposited into soils 1,000 miles away. Could it be that a mountain in one era becomes a field in the next? There is something gentle about it. This way the earth recycles itself. Not with explosions, but with erosion. Not with endings, but with dispersals. The land, once proud, now humble, giving itself away grain by grain, not because it was defeated, but because it was ready to become something else. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Not all coasts are where we left them. Some have wandered beneath the waves. Others have crumbled, pressed under new mountains. And some have simply vanished. Not because of disaster, not because of myth, but because the earth, in its quiet, restless way, is always folding its pages closed. Today, we walk shorelines that feel permanent, waves meeting land in a rhythm we trust. But beneath our feet, there are older lines, shadow coasts, ancient beaches, forgotten borders between land and water that once held tides, salt, wind, and then sank. Somewhere deep in the seabed, scientists trace these outlines. Ridges and shelves, abrupt edges in the ocean floor. Not quite trenches, not quite islands, just scars, gentle and sunken, in the crust. They call them passive margins, submerged memories where continents once whispered to the sea. There are no signs of cities. No ruins, only stone. Stone that, once upon a time, felt sunlight on one side and salt water on the other. Could it be the land remembers being loved by the ocean? The rocks do not tell us in words, but in their chemistry, their layering, their isotope whispers, there are hints. Oxygen locked in mineral form tells of shallow waters. Strontium isotopes drift like phantom trail markers, mapping the long retreat of coastlines. It is not a single answer, but a tapestry, one stitched in silence. A stone, then a cliff, then a reef, all built from memory, all buried by motion. Maybe that is the nature of continents, not to remain but to rearrange. What looks like ruin is simply rearrangement. Shorelines shift not because they are erased, but because they are needed elsewhere. Plates buckle, seas rise, the earth exhales, and so the edges of land are folded under or swallowed whole. We see hints in South America, where ghost beaches lie miles inland, fossilized with marine shells. In Africa, where old coral beds hide far from any reef. In Australia, where zircon grains remember coastlines older than the moon's current pull. And we wonder what stood there once. Not cities, not humans, but life, primitive, soft, unseen. Perhaps microbial mats clinging to tidal rocks. Perhaps the first things that felt both sea and sky, that tasted evaporation and knew that land was changing. The sea has always been a sculptor, but so, too, has been time. And together, they etched and erased these forgotten coastlines, again and again. It's not just erosion that removes. Sometimes the earth folds downward, pulls land beneath itself. Subduction swallows coasts whole, tucking them into the mantle. What once was a peaceful shore becomes a melt zone. basalt, magma, memory turned fluid. And when that molten rock eventually rises again, it does not bring the shore with it, but maybe it brings its echo. Could the mountains we see today once have been the beaches of another world? Maybe, maybe not. But the minerals remember. Feldspar born from weathered granite, once shaped by waves. Quartz rounded in currents, now buried in uplifted ranges. These ghost coasts live on not in form but in feeling. In the way stone carries smoothness, in the way fossils drift upward from their seabed graves. And still we search. Geologists scan beneath the Atlantic, beneath the Arctic, beneath the thick sediment blankets of the Indian Ocean. They find edges that end too abruptly, drops that shouldn't exist, continental shelves that do not match the maps. Some suggest these were once part of ancient supercontinents, the forgotten fringes of Gondwana, of Rodinia, of Uar. Names we gave to dreams of land that no longer fits together. Is it possible that 100 shorelines have disappeared? Not lost, but tucked gently beneath the present? Maybe the earth hides things not out of secrecy, but out of cycle. What it buries, it might one day lift again. A ghost coast re-emerging as a new ridge. A sunken plain tilted toward sky, and we, walking unknowingly above what once was edge, find ourselves surrounded by memory. We call them ancient shorelines. But maybe they were never meant to be permanent. Maybe the idea of a fixed boundary between sea and land was always an illusion, a breath held only for a while. The planet moves. The water rises. The crust yields. Not in anger, but in rhythm. And yet, if these coasts could disappear, if they could be forgotten by maps and memory, what other edges might we have already crossed without knowing? The earth keeps secrets, not loudly, not with force, but quietly, in the slow silence of subduction and uplift, of fold and melt, of time so vast it forgets to name itself. Beneath our oceans, beneath our feet, there may lie entire continents, lost not in myth, but in geology. Not Atlantis, not Lemuria, but real land, real mass, that once stood above sea level, cradling wind and rain, collecting sediment, lifting its shoulders into sunlight, before sinking back into the dark. We do not know how many there were. We do not know what they looked like. Maybe they were small archipelagos stitched together by volcanic threads. Maybe they were massive proto-continents caught between ancient collisions. Maybe they never knew a forest. Maybe they never knew life. Or maybe they carried life too fragile to fossilize, too brief to leave a trace. What if some lands rose and fell before eyes existed to see them? The ocean floor does not speak in language, but it remembers in patterns. Subtle curves in magnetic orientation. Faint anomalies in crustal thickness. Underwater plateaus like Zealandia, like Kerguelen, fragments of what might once have been whole. Zealandia hides beneath New Zealand like a forgotten sibling. Not quite submerged by accident, but by the slow, sinking shrug of the lithosphere. A continent without recognition, without borders, without myth. And yet, it was there. Could others have come and gone, too early for our knowing? We measure clues in magnetism. Rocks record the orientation of Earth's magnetic field as they cool. A memory of direction, locked in stone. But sometimes those directions do not align. They curve unexpectedly. They suggest movement not sideways but downward, as if something once existed in one place, then vanished below, leaving only its magnetic ghost behind. A shape with no form, a direction with no mass. In India's Deccan Traps, in Africa's Cratons, in the South Pacific's silent ridges, we find these scars. Not visible, not loud, just present. Present in the way broken things carry their outlines, even when their substance is gone. Present in the way silence can still suggest a song. Maybe some lands were swallowed before we learned to listen. Maybe we only hear their absence. Could the earth be full of places that once were? Continents are not fixed. They drift, split, drown, reassemble, and not all make it through. Some proto-continents never matured. Some microplates were scraped away like skin. Some collided, cracked, and never rose again. They became basement rock. They became buried shields. They became molten memory, melted and recycled beneath spreading ridges. No fossils, no ruins, only heat. And yet, the hints keep surfacing. Fragments of granite in the Indian Ocean, pieces of crust beneath Mauritius, too old to belong. They call it Mauritia, a theoretical landmass, broken and sunken, scattered across the seabed. It never had a name until we guessed it, never had a flag, but its zircon crystals tell a story 3 billion years old. A story buried in volcanic ash and isotopic trails. Not because the land wanted to be found, but because memory clings to minerals. Is it possible that the Earth has been dreaming of itself over and over again, building lands only to let them go? Maybe continents are experiments. Maybe they rise when conditions align: heat flow, crustal thickness, the gentle pressure of mantle plumes. And maybe they fall when the timing fails. Not in punishment, just in process. The cycle of trial. The rhythm of forgetting. We live in the afterglow of survivors. But beneath us are the stories of those that didn't last. And so we ask, if a continent forms and vanishes before anything walks upon it, was it ever truly real? Or does reality require witness? Maybe, maybe not. But the rocks seem to think so. They carry records even when we don't understand them. They align in odd directions. They contain isotope signatures that suggest pressure once felt, heat once endured, air once tasted, places once exposed to sky, now hidden in abyss. And we are just beginning to look, not for lost civilizations, not for myths carved in stone, but for the stone itself, for the fracture lines, for the density changes, for the buried evidence of landmasses no longer here. Landmasses that did not sink in cataclysm, but in quiet, folded under by the same crust that once raised them. Could there be dozens? Hundreds? Perhaps. Perhaps they are gone beyond recovery. Or perhaps one day, in a far future plate movement, one of them will rise again. A strange new land made of old foundations. A ghost made flesh. And when we step upon it, will it remember us? Or will we be the first to leave a mark? And yet, if entire continents could rise and fall without ever being seen, without ever being named, what else, even larger, even deeper, might still be missing? The continents we know today feel heavy, confident, sure of themselves. They rise with force, they crack with resistance, they echo with age. But once, before the bones of mountains hardened, before granite grew old, they were soft. Not soft like water, but soft like memory, like wax in a warm hand, like clay not yet set. In the Hadean and Archean dawns, the continents were still learning how to be land. They had no names, no north, no spine, only patches of buoyant crust, warm, uncertain, shifting. We tend to think of rock as permanent, but permanence on Earth is an illusion stretched thin across time. The early crust was light compared to the heavy basalt beneath it. It rose only slightly above the waves. It fractured easily. Heat pulsed from below. Not steady, but wild, chaotic, escaping in spasms. And so the land moved, not in neat tectonic plates, but in fragments. Patches of proto-continents, unsure of their edges, uncommitted to form. They called this crust felsic, rich in silica, light in density. The kind of rock that floats. But it was still new, still warm. It lacked the scars of weathering, the wrinkles of age. It hadn't yet been folded into mountains, or eroded into sand. It hadn't held forests, or fossils, or footprints. Simply was a beginning without identity, an architecture without blueprint. Could it be that the continents were still dreaming of what they might become? Some scientists call them cratons, the first strongholds of land. But even these cratons took time to solidify. Before them, the crust was chaotic, unstable, an archipelago of temporary surfaces wandering. These weren't the firm platforms of future civilization. These were the shy steps of Earth's earliest attempts at land. And they didn't stay still. They drifted, collided, sank, reformed, not because of intention, but because the world was still too hot to hold them steady. Maybe the continents didn't split. Maybe they never fully joined. In this era, nothing was fixed. There were no mountain roots to anchor a coast. No plates grinding in tidy rhythm. Subduction happened, yes, but it was sloppy, scattered, unsustained. Some parts of the crust thickened like scars. Others thinned into weakness. There were places where the land rose above water for 1,000,000 years, and then vanished again beneath the sea. What if our continents today are simply the hardened memories of this earlier softness? We see the clues in ancient zircon, tiny crystals older than anything else, carried in younger rock like forgotten heirlooms. They tell of a world where crust formed, only to melt again, where rocks were made, then remade. A cycle not of building, but of trying, of experimenting, as if Earth in its youth was sculpting itself by instinct, not yet knowing what it wanted to be. Could softness have been a kind of freedom? A world in which no landform was final, no mountain destined to last, no coastline promised permanence, only change, layered over change, like waves folding over each other. We often crave solidity, but maybe at the start the Earth needed fluidity. Not water, but a mobility of crust, a willingness to reconfigure, to forget, and perhaps this softness wasn't just geological, but philosophical. For in these lands, had there been any eyes to see, the horizon would have been untrustworthy. Shorelines rising, then disappearing. Islands forming, then crumbling. A place where direction held no promise. Where orientation was provisional. Where to stand was to risk submersion. A world where even land was not land for long. Not because the earth was cruel, but because it was still deciding. Still adjusting its temperature, still layering its mantle, still moving heat from the center to the surface. Each flicker of movement changed the shape above. Each plume of magma rewrote the edges, not in violence, but in inevitability. Maybe continents didn't begin as places to stand, but as places to change. We find their traces today, hidden in ancient cores of modern continents. The shields beneath Canada, Greenland, Australia. They are thicker now, hardened, cold. But once, even these anchors were soft, flexible, alive with potential. It's easy to forget that what is firm was once fluid, that every continent once trembled, not from earthquakes, but from indecision. So when we walk across ancient land, we are walking not on history, but on fossilized fluidity, the aftermath of molten choice. And yet, if the continents could once be so soft, so unstable, so unsure of their shape, what else beneath our certainty might still be learning to hold form? Not just rock, but memory. Not just history, but possibility. We like to think we were the first to build, the first to shape Earth into something more than chance. But Earth has been sculpting itself for billions of years, with patience we can barely imagine. So what if, before humans ever arrived, there were already patterns that mimicked intent, structures that behaved like systems, feedback loops that mirrored thought? What if the Earth, in its own deep time, had already produced something like technology, without biology, without will, but not without form? Could a planet produce technofossils without people? The word feels strange in this context. Technofossil. We imagine it as future ruins, plastic shards, metal cores, artificial polymers buried in future rock. But the term only means evidence of technology preserved in strata. What if the Earth, long before us, had already etched such evidence into the folds of its crust? Not machines, not wires, but systems, self-reinforcing feedbacks, self-perpetuating reactions, mineral veins that grew fractal-like not from chaos but from structure, ocean cycles that balanced heat and chemistry as if by design. Could such behavior be mistaken in deep hindsight for intelligence? Maybe not because it was intelligent, but because it was organized, persistent, patterned. We know of banded iron formations, great swaths of stone striped red and gray, pulsing with the breath of an ancient biosphere. They came not from factories but from microbes, billions of tiny lives altering the very atmosphere, leaving behind iron as a byproduct of oxygenation. Not artificial, but technogenic in a way. Life-altering matter. Feedback-made material. If we found these formations on Mars, would we ask different questions? Could it be that Earth's deep past holds ghost infrastructures? Not cities, not tools, but cycles, too consistent to be chaos, too fragile to be repeated? Some researchers suggest early life may have reached levels of complexity we struggle to see in the fossil record. Biofilms that changed the chemistry of entire oceans. Microbial mats with division of labor, built not from intelligence, but from thermodynamic opportunity. And when these systems collapsed, whether from changing climate or shifting substrates, they left behind only isotopic shadows. Not fossils, but residues. Fractionated sulfur, anomalous carbon, invisible fingerprints. What if these were our planet's first technofossils? Not crafted, but emergent. Not designed, but enduring for a time. And what about mineral logic? There are crystals that self-assemble into regular forms, not unlike circuits. Clay sheets that can hold patterns of electrical charge. Under pressure, certain rocks even mimic semiconductors. Could a landscape just once have stumbled into computation? Not because it was meant to, but because the laws of physics permitted it. Maybe not. Maybe Earth tried many things before us. Maybe we weren't inevitable. Maybe we were just next. It's tempting to think of ourselves as origin. But what if we're iteration? What if Earth has always tested the boundaries of organization, probing what energy can build before it decays, before entropy whispers it all back to silence? A buried continent of thoughtless process. A planet's early experiments with complexity. We know so little of the rocks that came before the continents. The Hadean and early Archean records are mostly gone. Subducted, remelted, erased. Only scraps remain. A zircon here, a chemical anomaly there. No blueprints. No skeletons. Just the implication that something happened. Something large, something ordered. But not preserved. Could an entire epoch of complex systems have emerged and vanished before fossilization ever learned to hold shape? Maybe that's the curse of being early. You build and it doesn't last. You organize and it dissolves. You change the planet and the planet forgets you. Maybe we remember ourselves not because we are smarter, but because the timing was right, because plate tectonics slowed, because erosion became memory, because someone invented the archive. But Earth? Earth has no archive. Not a perfect one. It deletes as it creates, forgets as it learns. Could it be that Earth has housed not one civilization, but many, each made not of minds, but of matter? Not intelligence, but structure? Not because it needed to, but because it could. And if so, then maybe we are not alone in the fossil record. Not in the way we think. Not with company, but with echo. A resonance in stone. A geometry once held. A chemistry once aligned. Technofossils, without a name, without a maker, without a future. And yet, if this much can be imagined from scraps and whispers, what else might be waiting, just beneath our feet, unspeaking, unrecorded, undone? And if even memory could fossilize, could there be a trace of the first touch between sky and stone? Before that moment, lightning had only the ocean, a flickering conversation between charge and salt, spark and spray. Thunder spoke over water, not land. There were no forests to ignite, no mountains to echo the sound back, just rolling waves beneath a pale, newborn sky. Planet of vapor and pulse. A sky still learning how to weep and how to strike. Before continents, storms were not drawn to peaks or ridgelines. They drifted, untethered. Clouds formed over warm sea, built themselves from vapor, and collapsed into themselves again. Rain fell into water. Lightning fell into water. A cycle of energy spent and forgotten. Nothing stayed scorched. Nothing held the scars. There were no lightning-blasted trees. No blackened earth. No ancient deserts glassed by heat. Just ocean, always ocean. swallowing every spark as if it had never happened. But something changed when land arrived. When the first cratons rose from the depths, still soft, still half-submerged, they interrupted that endless sky-ocean intimacy. Now there was form. Now there was resistance. Now lightning had something to aim for, something to strike, something to mark. Land broke the symmetry, and the sky responded, not because it meant to, but because it could. Maybe the earliest bolts to strike rock left no mark at all. Maybe they hit basalt cooled only weeks before, still warm with memory of magma. Or maybe they struck shallow tidipools, boiling their surfaces, coaxing chemistry where none had existed before. Could that spark, not the first spark of life, but perhaps its first push, have mattered more than we'll ever know? We know today that lightning splits nitrogen, that it shatters atmospheric bonds, reorders atoms, brings free radicals into soil. But what did it do before soil? Before roots and leaves and rivers and rot? Did it streak across empty plateaus of sterile stone, just to vanish? Or did it linger, not in flash but in aftermath, altering minerals, softening the boundaries between elements? Could the first strike on land have started something? Or ended something? Maybe it drew new minerals into being, fulgurites, those strange glass tubes made when sand melts mid-bolt. But there was no sand yet. No dunes. Only crust, raw and bare. Maybe lightning kissed a field of protoclase, leaving behind not just heat, but pattern, alignment. Could such contact between sky and ground have altered the future's chemistry? We don't know, but we wonder. And while we imagine the drama of lightning, the sound, the light, the suddenness, maybe early bolts were quieter than we expect. We hear thunder now because the world echoes it. But back then, who was listening? Who measured the delay between flash and rumble? Who saw the strike and marked it in memory? Only the land, only the stone. And stone does not remember the way we do. It absorbs, it dissolves, it erases more than it holds. Still, maybe somewhere in the oldest zircons there is a trace, a warped lattice, a fracture born not of pressure, but of energy. Not from within but from above. Could that be enough? Is it possible that when the sky touched Earth for the first time, truly touched it, not just skimmed the sea, something changed forever? A cycle was born, a new exchange, no longer just water rising and falling. Now energy flowed between realms. A dance began, one we still see in every storm, in every crack of thunder that rattles windows and hearts. But back then, it must have sounded different. Maybe the first thunder was not loud. Maybe it was soft, a whisper across stone, a long, low note echoing into silence. And perhaps that was enough. Enough to begin a rhythm. Enough to teach the sky how to find land. Enough to teach land how to hold fire. Because fire would come later. And trees, and ash, and charcoal buried in sediment. A quiet record of a world changed by electricity. But this was the first step. The first spark. Not because it lit anything, but because it happened, because it could. And yet, if even lightning was once silent, if even thunder had to learn how to echo, what else might we have mistaken for nothing? When really, it was the beginning of everything? Before the earth rose into peaks, it drifted in a kind of hush. The surface was not yet sculpted into towers. No Himalayas breaking the sky, no spines of jagged stone running across its face. Just low, quiet swells of crust, floating. Floating not from stillness but from an older kind of balance. A world before vertical ambition. A world without mountains. No snowcaps to melt into rivers. No cliffs to lean over. No echoes across canyons. The land did not reach. It did not lift. It did not collapse into valleys. Simply was broad, muted, level. A cradle of sameness stretched in every direction. Tectonic plates moved, yes, but slowly. Slowly enough that nothing crashed. Nothing crumpled. For a time, the earth seemed content to remain soft-spoken, low to the sea, distant from the sky. And in this flatness, something delicate unfolded. The air had no alpine chill, no thin-breathed altitudes. Winds wandered freely, unblocked. Rain clouds drifted without colliding into cold rock. Everything was closer. The atmosphere leaned down, embracing a planet still unsure how to rise. Without mountains, there was no orogeny, no great lifting of stone, no violent folding of crust, just slow convection, subduction in whispers, mantle plumes yawning upward like dreams, not yet fully awake. The lithosphere was still learning how to wrinkle, how to break, how to push. And because there were no summits, there were no views, no place to stand and look down, no vantage from which to see the curve of horizon or the vast sweep of time. The early Earth had no edges, no extremes, only presence. What does it mean to live in a world without high places? It means the drama was slower, softer. It means the sun set behind ocean mists, not cliffs. It means life, when it came, learned to crawl, not climb. Microbes clung to warmth, not elevation. Tides, not glaciers, shaped the early borders. The weather came not from mountain shadow, but from deep planetary breath, geothermal murmurs beneath the crust. In a world without mountains, there are no avalanche paths, no scree slopes, no fault-sheared ridgelines to tell the story of strain. So much of what we know today, about pressure, erosion, uplift, time, is written into stone that has been bent and broken and hoisted into air. But back then, there was no script like that. Just sediment settling slowly into stillness. Just basalt cooling under water. Just silence. And yet, even then, the seeds of peaks were being sown. Not in the crust, but in the inevitability of imbalance. Heat pooled in the mantle. Boundaries crept into friction. Eventually, some plates would move faster, would thicken, would press. And the Earth would begin to push upward. It always does. Not because it's trying to build anything, but because it can't stay still. But in the long pause before that happened, the flat Earth dreamed. Maybe it dreamed of pressure. Maybe it dreamed of heights. Or maybe it didn't need to. Maybe it was enough to simply float, cradled in evenness. To know only sea and sky, and the narrow strip of land between. A world not yet sculpted, not yet fractured, not yet raised. We often think of mountains as permanent, towering things that last forever. But they are fleeting, ephemeral. They rise, they weather, they vanish. Entropy waits for all of them. The Earth, over and over again, smooths its skin. But here, in this chapter of its life, it had not yet even wrinkled it. Could we imagine it? A whole world without summits? Could we walk across a continent and never gain or lose altitude? Could we breathe an atmosphere that had never had to flow over ridges? Could we live in a place where gravity never pulled anything down a slope? Perhaps the first raindrop to fall on a newly formed craton simply stayed, pooled, evaporated. There were no valleys to carry it away, no mountain runoff, no drainage basins, just stone and water, locked in stillness. And maybe that's where something changed, because even in stillness, imbalance arrives. One side warms more than another, one crust thickens, one current shifts. And in time, what was flat begins to tilt. Just slightly, just enough for one edge to rise. And when one edge rises, the other begins to fall. So maybe the world didn't need mountains. But maybe mountains needed the world to first be flat, to learn calm before it learned struggle. And yet, if Earth once lived without altitude, without height, without grand drama, what else might it still remember about the days before it reached for the sky? There was a time when Earth had no voice we would recognize. No rustling trees, no frog song, no thunder ricocheting between canyons. Before language, before lungs, before land gave echo to air, the sounds that existed then were soft, not silence but something older. A low, endless whisper in the background of time, the kind of noise you don't hear with ears, but with stillness. This was the hum of heat escaping the mantle. Not suddenly, but patiently. The creaking sigh of crust shifting under pressure. The burble of magma threading its way upward. Not in violence, but in ritual. Hydrothermal vents at the ocean's seams. Breathing minerals into black water. Bubbling like a planet exhaling through its pores. This was Earth's lullaby. Not written for anyone. Not played to be heard. Just existing the way fire exists, the way tides pull. Wind was already there, of course. Long before it passed through pine needles or skimmed wheat fields, it moved across open ocean. It shivered against the curve of waves, pressed against steam rising from newborn islands. In those days, the sky touched the sea without interference, and the two spoke constantly, in motion, in hush, sometimes in roar, but always in rhythm. And then there was the cracking. Quiet at first, the long, stretched groan of a lithospheric plate meeting its boundary. Not the violent split of catastrophe, but the aching sound of separation, of Earth folding in on itself in slow preparation. Beneath our feet now lie the remnants of those cracks, fossilized into fault lines. But back then, they were still unfolding, still deciding where to be. We may never know how it truly sounded. No recordings, no ears to remember. But we can guess. From simulations, from vibrations still locked in rock, from the isotopic whispers of ancient basalt. Maybe the soundscape of early Earth was more like a breath. Inhalation through vent, exhalation through ridge, the planetary equivalent of a sleeping giant turning in bed. Maybe there were tremors, but not like the ones we know. Not earthquakes, but birthquakes. Shifts made in preparation, not destruction. Movements without memory, but not without meaning. And what of entropy? Even then, the second law was at work. Energy dissipating, order unraveling. Every sound was a release. Every crack, a confession. Every plume of heat lost to space. A step forward in the slow unraveling of planetary youth. Not because Earth was dying, but because it was becoming. And maybe the soft noise of this time wasn't random. Maybe it was the sound of identity taking shape. Without birds, without mammals, without wind chimes or distant thunder, the land had no audience. And yet it continued to hum. A frequency not for hearing but for feeling. Subsonic, subliminal, deep time speaking in vowels we'll never pronounce. Could it be that the Earth still remembers this language? That beneath the chaos of cities and the buzz of wires, these sounds still linger? Under our highways and buildings and broadband signals, is the old rhythm still pulsing? The slow bubble of basalt beneath our toes? The crust cracking gently in tectonic sleep? Maybe we do hear it, in volcanoes that erupt not with rage but with rhythm. In geysers that follow underground scripts. In the faint tremble of a mountain shifting half a millimeter. Or maybe we hear it in ourselves, in our own patterns, our own need to return to quiet, to waves, to the sound of something bigger than language. The soft noise of prehistoric time is not gone. It's just buried. Under continents. Under time. Under us. And yet, if sound itself once had no ear, no echo, no listener, what else might still be happening beneath us, around us, never noticed, never named, but always there? Somewhere, deep beneath the youngest mountains and the loudest oceans, there are fragments of time that have never been touched. Not by glaciers, not by rivers, not even by thought. They hide in places the wind forgot. In pockets of crust that folded into themselves billions of years ago, protected not by design, but by chance. Inside them are crystals, tiny, unassuming, some no larger than a grain of salt. Yet they are the oldest witnesses on Earth. Zircon. A name that sounds like silence, a mineral that outlived oceans. It did not seek memory, but it holds it anyway. Inside each zircon crystal is a lattice, and inside that lattice, uranium, slowly decaying, gently ticking, like a heartbeat stretched across eons. As uranium becomes lead, a trail is left behind. A timestamp, a breadcrumb, not because the crystal chose to remember, but because it had no way to forget. We often think of fossils as stories. Shells pressed into stone, bones curled beneath soil, but these are recent memories, loud memories, surface memories. Zircon remembers something quieter, the temperature of magma, the chemistry of ancient seas, the exact moment it formed, sealed in isotopic ratios. This testimony is not in words or shapes, but in physics. Radiometric clocks. Time not told, but measured. And what does it remember? It remembers when Earth was barely solid. When crust was new, and the line between rock and fire was blurred. Some zircons, like the ones found in the Jack Hills of Western Australia, whisper of water, 4.4 billion years ago, long before oceans were thought to exist. Could it be that Earth cooled faster than we imagined? That liquid water, and perhaps even land, shimmered on its surface while the rest of the solar system still burned? Maybe, maybe not. The crystals don't say yes or no. They simply are. They pulse with lead and uranium, like ancient metronomes in the dark. They are honest but not emotional. Clear but never complete. And yet, there is something haunting about them, because they are so small and so still and so impossibly old. They do not record extinction events, or plate collisions, or even sunrise. They do not know trees, or rain, or breath. But they know time, deep time, pre-human time, pre-continental time, a silence that stretches before soil, before shorelines, before names. Holding one is like holding the absence of memory itself. And yet, they remember everything that matters. We often measure our lives by events, births, deaths, seasons. But the Earth does not. The Earth remembers by isotope, by decay, by pattern. Time on this scale is not a moment, but a migration. Of elements, of heat, of silence. These crystals traveled. From magma to crust. From crust to metamorphic rock. Carried by subduction. Buried. Pressurized. Exhumed. And still their atomic clocks ticked on. Not because they were unbreakable, but because they were ignored. Too small to matter. Too stubborn to be erased. Sometimes we think memory requires mind. But what if it doesn't? What if the planet remembers in ways we'll never understand? In the arrangement of atoms. In the curvature of faults. In the layering of sediments. Not thoughts, but imprints. Not ideas, but echoes. And if that's true, then maybe nothing is ever truly lost. Maybe the first raindrop is still somewhere, embedded in a crystal's chemistry. Maybe the first landfall, the first shoreline, the first silence. Maybe all of it is written, not in journals or myths, but in zircon. Not because Earth wants us to know, but because it can't help but keep. And what else do the rocks remember that we haven't learned to read? Are there minerals that bear witness to worlds that rose and fell without a trace? Are there isotope trails too subtle for our tools, too ancient for our confidence? Could it be that we are surrounded by memory we mistake for stone? Maybe deep time doesn't speak in human years at all. Maybe it speaks in lead, in lutetium, in samarium and neodymium, in ratios too quiet for the untrained eye. And maybe, just maybe, these ancient crystals aren't the exception but the rule. Maybe everything remembers in its own way, not because it's conscious, but because time always leaves a residue. Entropy isn't destruction, it's transition. It's the changing of one truth into another, one signature into a scar. And if that's so, if these grains of zircon still whisper of magma oceans and vanished rain, then what else might lie beneath our feet, waiting? What else have we missed? Simply because we forgot to listen. And yet, if even atoms can remember, what else might time be hiding inside the dust we've never thought to hold? There was a time when the Earth had no countries, no ridgelines to define a north, no valleys to cradle a south, no rivers carving borders between one thing and another. It was not unified because it tried to be. It was undivided because it had not yet learned to separate. Place of motion, not of names. A place of warmth, not of walls. Imagine standing in that world. Or rather, floating, because there would be no solid place to plant a foot, no shore to claim, no homeland to belong to, just water, and heat, and drifting plates beneath a sky untouched by maps. No lines, no flags, no directions, no places to leave, and no places to arrive. Before biomes, there were no forests to divide from desert. No mountains to call alpine, no grasslands to call prairie. There were gradients, yes, temperatures, pressures, salinities, but they flowed like music, not like borders. Blurred. Gentle. One thing becoming another, not because it had to, but because it could. Maybe there was no such thing as here or there. Maybe there was only everywhere. And what then was identity? Without location, without territory, without place, could it be that life once grew without a need for separation? That the earliest microbes didn't belong to a biome, but to an ocean? That their being wasn't defined by what they stood on, but what they floated through? Even thought, if thought could have formed so early, would have sounded different. Not shaped by coastlines or climates, but by currents, tides, shadows of drifting rock. It's strange to wonder what consciousness would be like without contrast, without edge. But maybe it wasn't strange to them. Maybe it was everything. We tend to think in opposites. Light and dark, land and sea, us and them. But the earth didn't begin with opposites. It began with unity, not because it was peaceful, but because it hadn't yet fractured. The earliest crust, soft, spreading, unsure, did not divide, it floated. Proto-continents were not lands in opposition. They were siblings in suspension. Each one a maybe, each one a question. There was no North Pole, no equator, just a slow-turning sphere, breathing heat, wrapped in vapor, slowly testing balance. And in that quiet world, where nothing had yet claimed its edge, there were no empires, no kingdoms, no coordinates, no compass to spin. There was only flow, only presence, only continuity, a kind of planetary anonymity. Maybe identity wasn't about place then. Maybe it was about process, about surviving, replicating, evolving, not belonging to a location but to a rhythm, to an exchange, to entropy itself. And what would it mean to live like that? Without ownership, without outline? Could life have felt less isolated, less distinct? Or was it more alone, floating in a world too open to grasp? Perhaps the first divisions weren't physical but chemical. One microbe here, another there, reacting differently, replicating at a different speed, absorbing light in a slightly different way. Slowly drifting apart, not as enemies but as options. Could this be the root of all difference? Not conflict, but drift? Not borders, but divergence? We know that over time, the Earth did begin to fracture. Supercratons collided and split. Climate zones emerged. Ice and heat, dry and wet, began to push against each other. Identity began to mean something more fixed, something more constrained. But before all that, it didn't. There were no tectonic collisions yet to raise the Andes. No continental shelves to define a coast. No reef to grow or erode. Just a planet in motion, remembering nothing, forgetting nothing, drifting forward in silence. And if the Earth began without edges, might we still carry something of that inside us? Some deep inheritance of wholeness, a pre-border memory, a longing for the world before place. Maybe that's why the sea still calls to so many, why a horizon can quiet the mind, why wandering feels like remembering. Not because we're lost, but because we're returning. Returning to a time when to exist was enough, when nothing needed to be claimed to be known, when identity wasn't where we were, but what we were becoming. And yet, if life could evolve before place, what else might it become after place is gone? There was no moment when shape arrived. It didn't thunder into being. It didn't claim the sky with lines or rearrange the oceans in a single breath. Came slowly, a soft accumulation of edges and corners, a drifting draft of permanence. Land, once scattered, began to cling together, folded, melted, lifted, held, not all at once but gradually, a map forming not from intention, but from motion. The first shapes weren't shapes in the way we know them. They didn't resemble anything we'd name. They were not continents, not yet. They were outlines still dissolving, wrinkled outlines at the margins of seas. Proto-continents whispering in tectonic dialect, cratons trying to remember what it meant to belong. And as land began to gather itself, everything else changed around it. The oceans adjusted their breath. Currents, once indifferent, now curled around the rising masses like silk around bone. Wind, encountering resistance, learned turbulence. Sky began to spiral. Temperature stretched itself into contrasts. Warm at the edges, cold where shadows fell. Storms found anchor. Rain found rhythm. Shape became story. Where there had once been only flow, there was now interruption. Not an ending, but a fold in the stream. And with it came the beginnings of difference. Is it possible that identity only needed a surface? That the moment land held, so did memory? Because the earth, once without face or direction, now began to offer context. Here, there, above, below, east where the sun stirred, west where it fell asleep. Coordinates emerged not from mathematics, but from shape. Maybe even life, humble as it still was, began to notice. Microbial mats, no longer drifting aimlessly in open sea, began to cling to stone, cling to stillness. Tidal pools emerged, temporary windows into permanence. And with each wave some water stayed, some creatures stayed, some beginnings stayed. Shape gave shelter, shelter gave time. Time gave evolution a place to root. Continents, though still young, still soft, began to reshape the atmosphere too. Elevation invited snow, plateaus slowed storms, erosion fed rivers that hadn't existed before. The hydrological cycle, once a sky-ocean duet, now became a trio. Rain fell not just on water, but on earth. And the earth remembered each drop. In gullies, in grooves, in grains. Geology began writing in cursive, a language of fold and fracture. Sediments stacked and pressed. Heat below, pressure above. Rock became recorder. Each ripple of shoreline, each volcanic breath, now left a signature. And so the shape of land became the shape of time. Is it possible that this is when beauty first began? Not beauty in the human sense, not aesthetic, but variation. Complexity, valleys, cliffs, hidden coves where light bent a little differently. The beginnings of preference, of paths, of the idea that one place was not quite the same as another. Before shape, there was only sameness. After shape, there was choice. And with choice came change. Ecosystems, still early, still invisible to the eye, began to reflect this. Where nutrients pooled, where wind shifted, where sunlight lingered just a moment longer, patterns emerged. Not fixed, but rhythmic. Cyanobacteria blooming in certain pockets. Mineral concentrations affecting chemical gradients. Every shoreline became an experiment. Every bay a hypothesis. Land did not just sit still. It participated. Even time, strange as it sounds, began to move differently. Mountains slowed decay. Valleys trapped it. Erosion etched memory while simultaneously erasing it. A paradox. Shape remembered by forgetting. Moments lost into layers and yet still there. Still traceable millions of years later in isotope trails and folded strata. Could it be that land invented nostalgia? That before shape there was nothing to long for, and afterward there was? A valley where a stream once flowed. A rock once exposed to sky now buried beneath it. The past no longer vanished completely. It became retrievable. Not always, not easily. But sometimes. And sometimes is all memory needs. Even animals, when they came, would be shaped by shape. Migration, nesting, shelter. But long before they ran or flew, the planet had already begun to map itself. Not through names, but through consequence, through influence, through contour. And so the Earth, once a featureless sphere adrift in time, became a surface of influence, of suggestion, a shape that shaped all things, including, eventually, us. And yet, if shape could form from motion, what else might motion someday reshape again? Long before reflection, there was only absorption. The sea drank the sky. Light sank into it without hesitation, without return. The clouds moved overhead, aimless and unanchored, casting shadows that fell into nothing. No outline, no terrain, no contrast. Just a flicker of brightness and gray, dissolving on the surface of an infinite blue. But then, one day, or rather many days layered into the long blur of geological time, land became still enough to matter. It held firm. Not perfectly, not evenly, but long enough that the clouds began to notice. Their passing now left impressions. Their shapes stretched across plateaus. Their moods skimmed across newly born hills. What had once been an unbroken conversation between wind and ocean now included stone. And with that stone came something new, something strange, something exquisite, a mirror. The first time the sky saw itself, it must not have known. A soft puddle clinging to a rocky rise. A still lake on a freshly lifted plain. Water, stilled by windbreak, began to hold light, hold color, hold form. Clouds, unsure of their own shape, now drifted twice, once above and once below. Sunsets blushed in both directions. Lightning forked not only downward, but upward again, reflected in tidal pools so clear they shimmered like memory. Could it be that the world needed to become uneven to begin reflecting anything at all? That flatness only absorbs, but shape returns? Maybe, maybe not. But something changed when the earth began to throw shadows. Light interrupted became story. A mountain turned golden. A cliff carved silhouettes. Forests would come later, but even without them, the land had begun its conversation with the sky. Not through words, but through light. Atmosphere thickened. Clouds evolved. Some wept. Some split. Others layered themselves in strange geometries only visible from below. And now, for the first time, there was a below. A contrast. A counterpoint. Rain no longer fell into sameness. It met resistance. It met form. And the world, for the first time, allowed itself to be shaped by falling sky. Canyons began not as gashes, but as whispers, water etching memory into mineral. Over and over again, the repetition of return, the patience of erosion, not because rain was violent, but because it was persistent. Not because land was weak, but because it listened. In these quiet exchanges between water and stone, the planet began to wear its moods on its surface. Every storm left a trace. Every dry season left a mark. Every frost a fracture. And somewhere in these minute changes the land became readable. Not to us, not yet, but to itself. Rivers traced the fingerprints of old rainfall. Valleys curled into the shapes of forgotten floods. Even wind, once unchecked, now learned to bend around obstacles. Learned to pause in sheltered places. Learned to wait. And all of it, the rain, the wind, the light, the clouds, began to mirror more than just themselves. They began to reflect relationship, dependency, mutual becoming. Could it be that reflection is never truly about what is seen, but about what is shared? When the sky first cast itself into the world responded not with clarity, but with softness, with distortion. The earliest reflections were blurred. Shivering outlines on wet stone, illusions in morning fog. But even these incomplete mirrors held meaning. Held the idea that something could be echoed without being copied. That identity could shimmer across more than one surface at once. And slowly, the world became aware of direction, of above and below, of highlands catching the sun first, and valleys holding night a little longer, of east drawing the light and west letting it go. This wasn't yet a world of names or nations or borders, but it had begun to have orientation, and with it memory deepened. Not memory like ours with emotion and thought, but memory written in shadow, in slope, in weather, a memory that shaped all that followed. What if, in that first reflection, the planet began to wonder? Not in consciousness, not in self, but in structure. A wondering encoded in the way mountains lean toward light, in the way rivers never quite forget gravity's pull, in the way cliffs remember the tides that first tried to pull them back into the sea. And if that wondering continues, where might it lead? Today, every lake that mirrors the sky continues that ancient echo. Every puddle that holds the moon, Every polished stone that catches a passing cloud is part of a lineage stretching back billions of years, to the moment when land, light, and liquid met and realized they could hold one another. And so, as the world reflected the sky too began to change, thickened, softened, found beauty in its own echo, began to paint its colors wider, redder at dusk, deeper at night, bluer in calm. Maybe even the sky, vast as it is, needed something below to know itself against. And yet, if a sky once